Hello everyone, I'm Extra Cheesy 87 and this is a Let's Play Trails of Cold Steel bonus video number 3. In the previous video we read Carnalia. Now, it's time to, if I can remember how the controls work, read the Red Moon Rose. I'm gonna definitely have to do this in probably like a couple, at least 2 different sessions. Because, my god, it long, dude. Oh my god, it long. Yeah, I mean, I figured, may as well read it on screen, right? I mean, I'm gonna read it regardless. Let's do a video, even if it will make it take, longer. I would like to maybe read at least half of it in this first session, and then either come back later today and read the rest, or maybe come back tomorrow. I don't know. Let's jump in, let's water up first, and get ready to go. Chapter 1, The Red Moon. Our story begins in Erebonia during the Middle Ages, some 200 years ago. The War of the Lions had concluded in western Zemuria, and Emperor Drykel, the driving force behind its revolution, had been deceased for over a decade. The imperial capital, Heimdall, was a beautiful traditional city with rows of cheerful red brick buildings that had earned it the name the Vermilion Capital. In one back alley of the city, however, a solemn mood reigned. Soldiers in the military uniforms paced up and down while a crowd of onlookers gathered to see what was going on. Now, if this city was in America, its nickname would just be Red City. They clung to the edges of the scene, refusing to disperse no matter how many times they were asked. At the center of the commotion lay a young woman. Her skin was shockingly pale, as if not a drop of blood ran through her veins. On her neck, 2 dark red spots stood out in stark contrast to the pallid flesh. Seeing this, a middle-aged soldier let out a loud sigh and took out his pocket watch. It was just after 6. He gave a curt order to his subordinates to find who she was, and the woman's body was swiftly carried away from the curious stares of the gawkers. After watching her safely borne away, he noticed a younger soldier following the woman, with his eyes as well. Alphonse. He tapped the young man on his shoulder. The soldier started, seeming to realize that he was on duty. Sorry, Garand. Somewhat flustered, Alphonse adjusted his beret, and then hung his head apologetically. Though snapped from his reverie, it was clear that he still had something on his mind. Oliva told you before to address me as sir while on duty. I am your commanding officer after all, Garand said jokingly. With a fond pat on the soldier, or Garad, let's try that. He reminded him to stay focused and then left to give quick orders to the rest of his subordinates. Alphonse quickly returned to his post, silently grateful for Garand's characteristically thoughtful gesture. Watching this exchange with another young soldier, the same age as Alphonse, scowling unpleasantly, he gave an audible tut. The girl's untimely demise, though shocking, was... hitting the buttons, nothing's happening, dude. There we go. But one in a series of grisly murders that were the talk of the town. Most of the victims were young women who had been out at night, and they had all met their ends through loss of blood. Or put another way, the victims had died after having all the blood drained from their bodies. Furthermore, all the bodies which had been found had something else in common. Each had bite marks on their neck as though they had been pierced by incredibly sharp fangs. It didn't take long for word of this to start to spread among the people of Heimdall. And all who... Okay, go back. Go back, please? No? You don't want to go back? Okay, there we go. And all who heard the rumors were quick to think of one of the many ancient legends which existed in Erebonia, specifically the legend that described immortal, monstrous creatures which roamed the land at night, feeding on the blood of humans. It was these very legends that eventually became the inspiration for the mass killing's new moniker, the Vampire Murderers. That night, after his duties were complete, Alphonse made his way to a small tavern tucked away in the corner of the capital by the name of Allegria, to enjoy a late evening meal. I was about to say Algeria, but that's not quite the same word. As he sat down to his dinner, a pretty girl near his own age with glossy chestnut ponytail studied him with obvious concern. So how is it, Alfie? Is it nice? I hope so. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. That girl, Luca, had been Alphonse's friend since his arrival in Heimdall about 10 years before. A shy, nervous smile tugged at her lips as she continued to watch him. Alphonse thought it felt a hot blush creep up his neck under her intense gaze, but he forced himself to eat. The beef stew she had made had a simple yet comforting taste to it. Is human meat. is human meat. Yeah, he assured her, it's really good. You've really gotten the hang of this. Luca relaxed at his words, and with a quick few self-conscious glances at the rest of the tavern customers, she seated herself opposite him. This lady is a vampire, definitely. Her courage seemed spent after this gesture, though, and they sat in awkward silence for some time until she made a hesitant, "How's work going these days?" At the word work, Alphonse's hand, which was carrying food to his mouth, instantly came to a halt. Despite the so-called vampire murders going on for quite some time, they have been unable to find a single clue to the culprit behind it all. The corpse of the woman from that afternoon flashed across his mind's eye, and the pleasant flavor of the stew died on his tongue. So young. She must have had family, friends, perhaps even a partner, just like anyone else. She had her whole life ahead of her, and yet that life had been brought to a sudden end, just like so many others before her. What the criminal had done was unforgivable, but the reprehensible nature of the crimes wasn't the only reason that Alphonse was obsessed with this case. Though sadly for him, there was very little that he could do to solve it now that it had been removed from the investigation team. Luca's soft voice brought him back from his thoughts. "Alfie, just don't go overdoing it, okay?" Her kind words made Alphonse remember how tense his expression must have become. Her concern embarrassed him. I'm fine, honestly," he said, in what he hoped was a reassuring voice. Alphonse is a member of a unit of the Imperial Army popularly known as the Garand Team, which was responsible for maintaining law and order in Heimdall. Garand, the team's commanding officer, had long cared for Alphonse like a father, and it was his recommendation that led Alphonse to join the army and become a member of the team. Since then, he lived in a dormitory near the army's guardhouse. His meal at the tavern finished, he sketched Luca a quick goodbye and took his usual route back towards the dormitory. An eerie red-colored moon... Red-colored moon hung full in the sky, bathing the brick buildings in a bewitching carmine glow. Walking along, Alphonse couldn't help but notice that the number of people in the streets at night was much smaller of late. Considering the culprit behind the vampire murders still hadn't been found, that was hardly surprising though, and yet, despite the fact that barely anyone dared to take to the streets, new victims kept appearing one after another, as if to mock the soldiers who patrol in the dead of night to keep them safe. The sense of fear in the city increased by the day, and was a deep unease unshared by all, even the shell soldiers. Silently, he swore to himself yet again that he would stop at nothing to catch whoever was responsible and bring them to justice. Suddenly, Alphonse stopped in his tracks, his troubled thoughts interrupted by the sight of an unaccompanied woman walking ahead of him. "Bro, Alphonse, don't do it!" The deep shadows blanketing the path made it difficult to be certain, but she seemed unsteady on her feet. To his further surprise, she then turned and disappeared down an even darker back alley. "Alphonse, no!" Considering the ongoing vampire murders, it was hard to believe that anyone could be so careless. With a resolute air, Alphonse set about following the woman, determined to call out to her and try to prevent her from coming to any harm. He entered the back alley, never to return. Gloom obscured all but the sharpest of angles. He squinted, willing his eyes to adjust. The soft outline of a woman's back took shape in the depths of the alley. "Excuse me, miss, I'm not sure it's wise to be..." Alphonse forgot what he was going to say, because he was dead. Something was wrong. Slowly the woman turned to face him. Her head hung limply to the side, long hair masking her face. The hint of eyes could be seen through the wild locks, but they held no focus, no awareness. She opened her mouth and moaned. Horrified by the disturbing figure before him, Alphonse froze. In an instant she was on him. Arms outstretched, she lunged and seized his neck in a crushing grip. Taken completely by surprise, he fell backwards, the weight of her pinning him down. Slowly, methodically, she began to squeeze. "Ah!" he croaked. How could that seemingly lifeless woman be capable of such unnatural strength? No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pry her hands from around his windpipe. All his training, his useful strength, none of it seemed to count for anything against those unyielding claws. Her fingers dug deeper still, and the already painful absence of air became an indescribable agony. From his low vantage point, Alphonse was able to see more of the woman's face now. It swam in and out of his view of his oxygen-starved brain, but her pale flesh was almost luminous against the darkness of the night. Her lips were chapped and colorless. As she squeezed, they began to part in a hungry leer, the edges splinting. Dinner. Although Alphonse could barely understand what was happening, his instincts knew exactly what the woman was about to do. He bucked and writhed desperately in her grip, but her hold was too great. Black began seeping into his vision. Even as he remembered the saber belted to his waist, he was too weak to draw it. Blank-eyed woman thrust her face eagerly towards his neck, teeth barred and mouth yawning wide. Alphonse began to close his eyes. Death seemed to be his only choice. But just then, the world in his fading view exploded. Guessing somebody saved him. Okay. So that took 10 minutes, and that was the first chapter. Oh god. And it's like the shortest one. Okay, this one's only 15 pages? Yeah, okay, so it's like the third shortest one. Oh god. Oh no. Chapter 2, Vampire Hunter. As the world blurred, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a geometric shape pass before his eyes. It was the sole of a boot, moving at an incredible speed. The bone-crushing thud, the woman was thrown aside, and Alphonse's field of vision filled with the night sky. Free of the woman's grasping fingers, he called furiously, sucking in as much fresh air as his tortured throat could manage. "Are you alright?" asked a clear voice beside him. The source of it was a second woman, who, he was certain, had not been there moments ago. She wore a navy blue overcoat paired with matching navy blue beret. Her ash blonde hair reached as far as her neck, and her features were dignified, though they still retained clear vestiges of childlike innocence. At a guess, she seemed to be roughly the same age as Alphonse himself. Still busy processing the recent events, Alphonse made no reply to her query. The woman watched him for some time before coolly stating, "You appear to be mostly uninjured at least. I'm glad to arrive in time." Seemingly satisfied he would survive, she turned away and studied the crumpled form of the woman who had attacked him. "That," she said with a note of distaste, "is a ghoul, a thing a person becomes after their blood has been drained by a vampire." As she spoke, she kicked her left boot against the ground. The tap 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 seemed to punctuate each word. It appeared to be the boot that she had used to kick the woman ghoul away from him. As he followed the restless drumming of her boot, he suddenly thought, "Vampire? I have no issue with you idling about, but I would prefer if you stood aside before doing so. You are in my way." Her words were sharp, but no sooner had she said them than a creaking sound filled the area. The ghoul, which had been motionless on the ground while they were talking, was now slowly rising. Its contorted body lifted from the cobblestones using only the power of its legs. I guess normally use your hands, but seems kind of a weird way to phrase it. It was a grotesque spectacle and utterly unnatural, and if the ghoul was bothered by the earlier blow, it showed no sign. Without warning, the ghoul suddenly kicked at the ground like a wild beast and propelled itself towards them. Alphonse jerked to his feet and leaped forward to shield the blonde woman. The exact moment the ghoul's nails reached Alphonse, the blonde woman behind him calmly put her hand in her overcoat pocket. In one smooth motion, she drew something out of it. It was a long, thin rapier. Its surface was a radiant silver, polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected the smoldering glow of the red moon. Without a moment's hesitation, she thrust the rapier forward. Its pointed end flew past his neck, piercing the ghoul's throat effortlessly. With an equally smooth motion, she withdrew the blade, and the ghoul fell to the ground and didn't move again. The menacing aura it had been radiating dissipated into nothing. Alphonse stood fixed to the spot, dumbfounded by what he had just witnessed. A small trickle of blood ran down his neck where the rapier had grazed it. "I do believe I just told you to stand aside. I suppose you must not have heard me." Sighing, she took the ghoul's blood from her weapon before returning it to its scabbard. "After all, if you had heard me and acted that way regardless, I would be forced to conclude that you were most foolish indeed." Her blunt words and composed expression finally brought Alphonse back to his senses. I was just trying to keep you from getting hurt, but never mind that. What's going on here anyway? Who are you, and why was that woman trying to..." He had intended to finish his sentence with the words, "eat me," but the possibility of what might have been was too terrifying to voice. What was clear to him was that the woman before him had saved his life and stabbed the ghoul to do so. Looking at Alphonse's confused expression as he wrestled with the situation, she gave a resigned sigh. "You appear to be a member of the military, I presume. Then are you familiar with the so-called vampire murders?" Yeah, of course." "Well, then if I were to tell you that those vampire murders really are the work of a vampire, would you believe me?" Alphonse gaped at her. "What?" Without answering, she turned away from him and walked over to the ghoul. Gently she lifted it from the ground so Alphonse could get a good look at the face. What had been a terrifying creature just moments ago was now a woman again. Her expression was completely peaceful. Is it going to be the same woman that we saw earlier? Her expression was completely peaceful. It was hard to believe she was the same woman who had attacked him before. "Look closely here," the blonde woman instructed. She pointed at the corpse's neck, specifically at the two red dots on the surface. They were completely consistent with the marks of all the other victims of the vampire murders. "It certainly looks like a vampire bite, wouldn't you say?" She said this as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Alphonse still looked puzzled, but she ignored him and continued. "Humans who die as a result of having their blood sucked by vampires become ghouls, who then try and feast on other humans. This sword," she said, tapping the scabbard, "has been blessed by the church and is capable of putting them to rest." Her words brought the bizarre spectacle he had witnessed to the front of his mind. While he was interested in the church part of her statement, he had found more pressing questions to ask. You seriously say this was the work of a vampire? You really expect me to believe something so ridiculous? Whether you choose to believe it or not is the truth. A very unfortunate truth, but the truth nonetheless, she said in the same cool, disinterested tone. Now, I do wonder if it's possible that lady here is actually a Grail Knight or something, you know, someone important in the church. Alphonse struggled with it. The truth as she presented it beggared belief, and yet everything she said added up and seemed consistent. It was equally hard to believe that everything was a lie. He subconsciously touched his throat. The ache there only bolstered her position. He found himself willing to believe her. There is a vampire in this city, of that I am certain, and I, she continued, placing her hand on their chest, and here to put it into it. A period of silence followed. Undeterred, the woman began to talk again. Still, this is not ordinarily a matter that laymen should be involved with, so I would recommend that you forget all you have seen and heard here. And I would prefer, she added with a meaningful glance, if you kept all this to yourself as well. She turned to walk away. Wait, Alphonse called out to her. He swallowed, stood a little straighter. Will you allow me to help you? The blonde woman came to an abrupt halt. She turned her head to look at him. It was clear that his sudden question had caught her off guard. Slowly, she faced him completely. Well, I certainly wasn't expecting you to propose something quite that ridiculous. What could I possibly stand to gain by allowing you to help me? Her tone was sharp as ever, but Alphonse is unfazed. Around 10 years ago, both of my parents were killed. They died the exact same way as the victims of the vampire murderers. I keep saying murderers instead of murders. Shock showed through the woman's normally blank expression. Alphonse continued. I don't remember much about that day, but there's one thing I can't forget. One thing I'll never be able to forget. As he spoke, the memory returned to him vividly. Roughly 10 years ago, Alphonse and his family had lived in a village in a remote region of the Empire. His father was a member of the army, serving in a unit stationed nearby. But it was an uneventful post, and they lived a quiet life. It was as normal and peaceful an existence as one could have until that fateful day when Alphonse returned from playing outside. It was then that he saw a sight that would be burned into his memories, his dreams, forever. There in his home, he found the corpses of his parents laying in a room stained with blood. Their bodies had been drained and their necks were marked by strange bites. The incident was so unpleasant and bizarre that even then, there were those who believed that it was the work of a vampire. The army conducted an investigation, but were unable to find any clues that would lead them to a suspect, and eventually the case was deemed unsolvable. Left with no living family, Alphonse was taken in by his father's best friend and fellow soldier in the army, Garand, and ended up living in Heimdall. What she was saying was true, and the vampires really did exist, then maybe one was actually responsible for his parents' death. From the look on her face, it seemed she thought that could be the case. Alphonse shook his head, though it was more to for himself. It doesn't really matter if it was the work of a vampire or not. I feel as though by solving this case, I'll finally be able to move on from what happened that day. That's why... Another long silence fell between them. The blonde woman seemed to be in deep in thought, and Alphonse waited patiently for her reply. Eventually, she let out a short sigh. As part of the army, you have access to restricted information on the murders. Perhaps your assistance might allow me to find the vampire more quickly. She put her hand inside her coat and took out a short sword with the same silvery glow as the rapier she had used earlier. This will allow you to fight against ghouls and vampires. If you'll be cooperating with me, I expect you to protect yourself. Alphonse glanced at her face. Her expression clearly said she wouldn't broke any nonsense. His resolve would need to be firm and unwavering, and he would need to be prepared to encounter more ghouls like the one from before. Furthermore, he would have to be ready to face the vampire that lurked in the city once and for all. With a resolute air, he accepted the sword from her. My name's Alphonse, and everyone here just calls me Al, except for that one lady who calls me Alfie, but we're not going to mention that. The blonde woman looked down at her now empty hand, and the corners of her lips quirked up slightly. She raised the edge of the skirt beneath her coat, and gave him a respectful curtsy. My name is Rose. I imagine that our time together will be brief, but I look forward to working with you nonetheless. Okay, so I feel like these two chapters are longer than all of Carnelia. 30 pages! Alright, well, I might have to take a break early. Because I can already, like, feel my tongue starting to die. Alright, Chapter 3. Foreboding. The next morning, Alphonse forced himself in his commanding officer's Garand's office. He had come to request permission to independently investigate the vampire murders. Garand scratched his head before giving Alphonse a questioning look, his eyes filled with the kind of vitality one would expect from a much younger man. You want to pursue that case all on your own? Alphonse cleared his throat nervously. He was well aware that what he was asking was completely unreasonable. Not on my own. A civilian has agreed to help me conduct my investigation. The two of us will be working together. Bro, that doesn't convince me. You're like, oh, I found some person off the street that's gonna help me. Come on, Alphonse. It sounded pretty weak to him, but Rose had been adamant that they keep the truth of the matter to themselves. It wouldn't be to the benefit of society for the existence of vampires to become widely known, she had insisted. As such, trying to arrange for us to be able to investigate the murders by ourselves without interruption, aside from a cool farewell for now, those had been her last words before disappearing into the night. I mean, I could see her being like a girl knight. Maybe like her duty is to deal with monsters or something. Because I mean, basically every character that shows up in the fictional books has been real, for the most part. I mean, there's some that like we haven't seen Agnes per se, but I think that's the only example. Well, I guess the back alley doctor, but previously, right, like every character in the books has been kind of real, like, you know, gambling man, even though we never read those. You got the side story that implies that he's a real person and stuff like that. And what she said made sense. There was simply no way that Garan would believe that vampires existed, even if it was his surrogate son trying to persuade him. After all, despite seeing a ghoul with his very own eyes, part of Alphonse still wanted to believe that it had all been a dream. To compound the problem further, for reasons that Alphonse wasn't privy to, Rose seemed opposed to anything other than investigating the matter covertly. As such, her joining the team formed to officially investigate the murders was off the table. Alphonse was therefore left with no choice but proposed the two of them investigate together in secret. Alphonse was not surprised then to see Garan's less than willing expression. Listen, Al, as your guardian, I've got a responsibility to look after you. That's why I want you to raise you to be a fine soldier, and while I don't want you putting your life in danger for no good reason. Alphonse flushed. He'd already been removed from the team investigating the murders, as well as taken off night patrol duty. Garan was well aware of his fixation with the case. That was exactly why he was afraid that Alphonse might end up going too far in his attempts to solve it, and get injured or worse. Garan, sir, I understand what you're trying to say, and I appreciate your concern, but... Seeing Alphonse's determination, Garan hesitated. The boy standing before him was calm, with clear eyes. Where previously there had been recklessness, now purpose and resolve seemed to rule. After a lengthy silence, he let out a sigh of resignation. You really do take after your father. He smiled fondly, but quickly switched to his official commanding officer voice. I expect you to give your utmost to successfully resolving the mystery behind these murders. However, I will approve of this mission only on the condition that you report daily on the results of your investigation. Alphonse almost responded in his usual casual tone, but caught himself just in time. He coughed, cleared his throat, and stood to attention. Garan chuckled. Just be sure not to put yourself needlessly in danger, understood? And if anything happens, inform me immediately. Yes, sir! Alphonse gave a deep bow, grateful for his guardian's kindness. I see that everything went well. That is good news. Another thing is that's, like, not only are the pages longer, there's less, like, half pages than in Carnelia, where, like, a lot of the pages in Carnelia were only, like, you know, quarter pages. Whereas these are all, like, basically full. The two of them were in the corner of the shopping district when the first victim of the vampire murders had been found. It was in the middle of the day, but the alleyway in which they stood was gloomy and draped in shadows by the looming buildings that surrounded it. The second he had stepped into the narrow passageway, Rose had appeared out of nowhere. Just like the previous day. Because the place where Alphonse had been attacked by the ghoul the previous night was currently under investigation by the Garan team, they thought it best to steer clear of it for the rest of the day. As such, they had decided to examine the scene of the earlier murder instead. Unlike the previous night, Rose had neither her coat nor her sword with her. Instead, she wore a simple dress in the local style. Anyone seeing her for the first time wouldn't be able to tell that she was anything more than a perfectly ordinary girl. But according to Rose, neither vampires nor ghouls were able to operate in daylight, and thus battle-ready wear was unnecessary. Everyday clothing also had the benefit of allaying suspicion by blending in, she said. It was fine logic in theory, but with Alphonse still garbed in his military uniform, they made for an unusual pairing. As such, Alphonse couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief when he realized how few people were in the surrounding area. The scene of the first murder still had a solemn air about it. Alphonse set about scouring the area, and as he mused over the case details involving the victim, a question came to mind. Thinking about it, I never heard about any of the earlier victims turning into ghouls. Is that because you've been defeating them? Rose shook her head. No, in previous cases, I was able to purify the bodies with thaumaturgy before they turned into ghouls. I'd rather not harm the bodies of the deceased if I can help it. Thaumaturgy, as Rose explained it, was the collective name for special techniques used by a small number of people belonging to the Septian Church. The power of thaumaturgy was also apparently the reason why Rose's rapier and Alphonse's short sword were capable of defeating ghouls and vampires. Curious, Alphonse asked Rose if she was connected to the church, to which she responded, "Feel free to think of it that way." He itched to probe her more on the subject, but she began explaining the particulars about ghouls, so he let it drop. Since the murders had started, it seemed that the time it took for a corpse to turn into a ghoul was decreasing with every kill. Alphonse's encounter with the ghoul the previous night was the first occasion that she had been unable to purify a victim in time. As such, she had been left with no choice but to fight. Still, that possibility was well within my expectations. This is not the first time it has happened after all. That someone like yourself would appear and try and get their involved certainly wasn't, however. Rose said with a giggle, causing Alphonse's ears to turn pink at the tips. Anyway, he said, crouching down to inspect the ground level, have you managed to gather anything about the culprit from your previous investigations? Rose nodded. Judging by the bite marks left on the victims, I believe that the vampire is likely male. Furthermore, despite victims being found all across the city, the bite marks look the same as one another. That suggests the work of a single vampire. Beyond that, however, Rose fell silent. Is something bothering you, Alphonse asked without thinking. Yes, actually, it may be possible that the vampire lurking in the city is... She stopped in mid-sentence. Her gaze was focused on something behind Alphonse. Turning around, he saw a young man in a military uniform, much like himself. It was someone he knew. Oh, is that the guy who tutted at us? You fucker. You're gonna pay now. Elroy, what are you doing here? I was about to ask you the same thing, the other man grumbled. Elroy was a fellow member of the Garan team who had joined about the same time as Alphonse did. That combined with the two being roughly the same age, one might expect them to get along well, but in reality they ended up arguing about everything. It had been like that for almost as long as Alphonse had known him. I'd heard you formed a separate team to check out the murders, but I had no idea it was switched to a pretext of meeting a woman during working hours. Elroy sneered. Alphonse stifled his annoyance. At least it seemed as if the other man hadn't overheard their earlier conversation. Clearing his throat, Alphonse said evenly, "She's a civilian who's assisting me with my investigation, so knock it off. And you, what are you doing here?" "Nothing in particular. I just happened to be passing by. I've got to patrol a much wider area now thanks to all this vampire nonsense." Alphonse stood and gave him a cold look. "Watch what you're saying. People in this area have lost family and friends because of these murders." Elroy snorted and cast an unclearing glance at the spot where the first victim had been found. I mean, seriously, vampire murders? We're supposed to be the Imperial Army, not a bunch of country bracers. Are we seriously considering the possibility that fairy tale creatures like that exist? And besides, what kind of idiot goes out at night when there's a serial killer on the loose? They were asking for it, if you ask me. People need to stay in their damn homes and stop making more work for us. You son of a... Enraged by the sheer callousness of Elroy's words, Alphonse started towards him, or tried to, rather. Strong, unyielding fingers held him by the arm. Completely expressionless, and without so much as a glance to Elroy, Rose whispered, "Arguing with him serves no purpose. That time would be better spent investigating." He spoke calmly, but her words were sharp and dismissive. What she said was right, though, and hearing it was enough for Alphonse to cool his temper. As she said it, there was more important things to be doing. He had sworn that he would solve these murders and put the past behind him, and that needed to be his foremost priority. He took a deep breath to regain his composure. The reassuring weight of the silver sword hidden in his uniform further reminded him of what he needed to do. Watching them, Elroy gave a bored, derisive laugh. "Oh, and civilian helper, or whatever you are, don't go wandering around at night either. The last thing the army needs is more dead bodies to clear up." And with a mocking wave, he left them. After their inspection of the first crime scene, Alphonse and Rose spent the remainder of the day scrutinizing the scenes of the second and third murders. But in the end, their search yielded no fruit. After reporting their progress to Garand, he made his way to Allegria, where he had promised to meet Rose to discuss how they would proceed with their investigation. The city around him was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun when Alphonse finally stepped into the sparsely populated tavern. He found Rose sitting at a table near one of the windows. Once again, she was wearing the navy coat from their first meeting. It seemed safe to assume that the rapier she had used that night was inside it too. "Evening," she called out to him. "I was expecting you to be here sooner." Alphonse didn't reply. He was too busy staring at the girl sitting opposite her. "What's wrong, Luca?" Luca turned at the sound of her name, eyes so wide and moist with tears threatened to fall at any moment. "Alfie, just what is this woman to you? What?" Perplexed, he looked over in Rose's direction, as if seeking an explanation. Rose favored him with a bland expression. "All I did was walk into this tavern and state I would like an out-of-the-way table to discuss my future with Al." And she has been pressing me with endless questions ever since. She sighed and shrugged her shoulders, as if she understood the situation no better than Alphonse did. Seeing this, he let out an even greater sigh. Before Luca could launch into another interrogation, Alphonse set about explaining Rose's role as a civilian helper aiding an army investigation, and after several reassurances, he was eventually able to clear up the misunderstanding. Luca's relief seemed to fill her head with renewed energy. Cheerfully, she bounded up from their table and made their way into the back of the tavern again. Their departure, she, too, left the gazes of the other curious and amused patrons. Rose and Alphonse bent to discussing their investigation. Vampires, Rose elaborated, were only able to use their powers at night. During the day, they were no different from ordinary humans. Unfortunately, this meant that even if they were to encounter one, neither of them would be able to tell. If they hoped to end the murders, they would first need to find some kind of clue as to the vampire's true identity. At one point during the conversation, Alphonse went pale at the thought that they might have to exhume the corpses of previous victims in order to reinvestigate them, but Rose assured him that would not be necessary. More people will just die anyway, we can just check them right after they die. To his great relief, she had already checked them thoroughly for clues. Even that gruesome task had yielded little more information than the similarities between the bite marks, though. Their vampire foe was a cunning one. A number of bodies and lack of clues all pointed towards a careful killer, who more than likely was living right there among them as an ordinary human. After working their way through the simple meal that Luca brought them, Rose casually glanced over to the back of the tavern. "You seem rather close to that girl," she murmured. It took a few moments for Alphonse to realize who Rose was referring to. "Yeah, I suppose you could say that. I've known her for 10 years now, after all." He had first met Luca when he was brought to Heimdall-Grande. Initially, he had stayed in a house near the tavern, and being brought by it often, the two of them quickly became friends. As an orphan, Luca's support over the years meant more to him than words could express. Telling Rose all this, Alphonse could feel his cheeks heating. He began fidgeting awkwardly. "I'm a little envious," Rose said. As she spoke, Alphonse noticed a change in her expression and tone. Usually she said things sharply, or with an air of cool detachment. Her face also rarely betrayed her inner thoughts. Now, though, he caught a hint of loneliness. Unable to let this pass unnoticed, Alphonse opened his mouth to comment. Suddenly, Rose jumped out of her seat. Her chair fell to the ground with a crash. Once again, the two of them became the subject of a room full of gazes. But she paid that fact no mind and stared out of the window, her eyes wide open. "What is it? What's wrong?" Alphonse whispered loudly. "It's nearby, I can sense it." "What do you mean? The vampire," she hissed. No sooner she'd said it, she raced over to the tavern's owner, who was busy at the back of the building. Alphonse chased after her. He had never seen her in such a panicked state before. "Where's the young lady who was here earlier?" Rose asked the puzzled tavern owner, who didn't appear to have any idea who she was referring to. So either she's going to be a victim, potential victim, or she's the vampire. It was then that Alphonse realized that he didn't see Luca anywhere and hadn't seen her since she brought them their food a half hour before. After telling this to the owner, he finally seemed to realize what was being asked. Now that you mentioned it, I would have expected her to be back by now. I asked her to run an errand over the grocery store opposite here. Alphonse and Rose exchanged a glance and instantly understood what the other was thinking. Overcome with a sense of foreboding, the two of them rushed out of the shop without saying a word. Okay, so it took 32 minutes to read 3 of 14 chapters. By God, it long. I'm gonna take a quick break here, just to rest the voice for a second, and then we will get back to it. All right, we're back. I'm gonna try and read up to. I'll probably have to split this into like 2 different days. I would like to read up to chapter 7 today. I mean, it'll all be one like long 45-hour long video, but for me, probably gonna have to split this up into a couple different recording sessions because I do need to record some other stuff and don't really want to spend like 2.5 hours straight just reading this. Even though I actually am like kind of interested. I mean, we're only like, you know, like less than a quarter of the way through it basically, but it's actually off to a pretty good start. It's a little long-winded, would be like kind of my initial interpretation right now. It doesn't need to be as long as it is to get across the information it's doing, but overall, I mean, I'm kind of interested in what's going on here. Chapter 4, The Black Vampire. 2 people ran through the streets of Heimdall down cobblestones dewed with moonlight. In the lead was Rose, her navy blue coat flapping in the wind, just like the wings of a hawk as she pursued their foe. Just behind them, and shocked by her speed, was Alphonse, head whipping left and right as he searched for Luca. There had been no sign of her on the short path between the tavern and the grocery store where she had apparently been sent. When Rose had sensed the ominous presence of the vampire outside the tavern, she immediately set about following it. Alphonse didn't know what kind of trail she had picked up, but she flew down streets and narrow paths without hesitation, as if following a puppet strings back to its master. To find his friend, they now followed the vampire, spurred by the terrible certainty that the two were connected. "Eek! The sound of a piercing shriek filled the air, sending a chill up Alphonse's spine and freezing him to the spot. There was no mistaking its owner. It was Luca's voice. Luca! Alphonse cried. Where are you? The sin is coming from this way, Rose called, before rushing down a narrow alleyway. Bro, just ban alleyways. Ban them. We don't need them. Alphonse followed, stumbled over his feet in his desperate attempt to keep up with her. He could barely breathe from running so much, but he ignored the tightness in his chest and sped on. Kicking aside boxes and garbage piled up here and there on the path, he eventually reached the other side of the alleyway and emerged into a neighboring street. In it stood someone or something. It was draped in a black overcoat, the upper half of its head wrapped in a large cloth. Not even its eyes were visible. The only part of the body that remained uncovered was the bottom half of its face. A deathly pale expanse of flesh with a twisted smile at its center. At first glance, it almost seemed human. Alphonse was not fooled. This is it, he thought. This is the vampire. It was then that he realized the black-clad figure was holding something in its arms. Luca. Just as the realization hit, the vampire's rictus of a grin yawned wide as it opened its jaws. Alphonse caught a fleeting glimpse of a beast-like fangs, too long, too sharp to be human. Seeing them, Alphonse instantly recalled the bite marks on the murder victims' necks. As he watched, horrified, those needle-like teeth descended towards Luca's throat. Rose was the first to act. In a movement so fast he could barely track it, she withdrew several thin objects from the inside of her cloak and threw them at the vampire. Alphonse remembered her showing them as part of her vampire hunting kit. Knives flashed in the moonlight as they sped towards the creature. As it was about to sink its fangs into Luca, the vampire turned towards them, dodging the knives just in time. Luca fell to the ground and the vampire jumped high into the air, descending just behind Alphonse. It happened so fast that Alphonse was still staring at the spot the vampire had been when it landed silently behind him. The creature that was terrorizing Heimdall, the murderer of countless women, the thing that attacked Luca. It was so close. Anger overrode fear. Alphonse clasped the hilt of his military saber and drew it. He spun around, slashing horizontally across the vampire's chest. The blade made contact. The vampire laughed. Alphonse watched, transfixed. As the wound on the creature's chest healed, the next instant the vampire punched its right fist out, towards the pit of Alphonse's stomach at incredible speed. Ah! The impact was so great that it forced him back, expelling all the air from his lungs. And while he was able to protect his vital organs, he had still suffered the full brunt of the blow. He doubled over in agony. "Get down!" Rose cried out from behind him. With no choice to obey her as best he could, he let himself fall limply to the ground. As he did, the stir of air from Rose's lightning-fast rapier thrust ruffled his hair as it passed. The vampire didn't laugh this time, perhaps sensing danger from the rapier's silver radiance. It threw up its left arm in defense. The blade pierced flesh, and Rose followed through with her strike, skewering the limb right through the other side. The tip stopped just before reaching the creature's chest. White smoke poured out from the wound. Unlike Alphonse's earlier attack, it seemed Rose had actually been able to damage it. "Hey Rose, why'd you give me a fucking useless sword, asshole?" Rose tried to move the sword, but it was stuck fast. The vampire smiled again. So you must be the vampire hunter responsible for sealing those ghouls. She ignored him and tried the sword again. "I had heard that many of my brethren had fallen at the hands of a vampire hunter," he continued in a low, sibilant voice. "But I certainly did not expect the hunter in question to be a mere girl." Rose gave a derisive laugh. "Brethren, I think you shall find that the word is meant for humans, not beasts like your kind." The vampire hissed and she bared her teeth at it as they both fought for control of the sword. Rose tried pushing forward, urging the blade on, while the vampire kept the muscles in his forearms as rigid as steel to thwart her movement. Still lying on the ground, Alphonse gathered just enough strength to begin crawling his way to Luca's side. When he reached her, a quick check lessened the mad pounding of his heart. He was unconscious, but otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over him. Rose's voice brought Alphonse back to the situation at hand. She and the vampire were still locked together, each refusing to yield. "If we were to stay like this until morning, your power would surely weaken significantly, and I would be happy to spend the night with you until then if you wish," she suggested to it. It made an unsettling sound, somewhere between a snort and a laugh. "I'm afraid I'll have to refuse your kind proposal, my beautiful lady. Not least because, thanks to you and your pitiful human friend, my evening meal's been rather spoiled." As it uttered those words, the vampire's outline began to blur. Alphonse blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but it was no trick of the shadows. The creature's form was dissipating into a fine, black mist. Though its mouth was disappearing like the rest of it, its voice somehow carried on. "Should either of you seek to disturb my dinner again, I hope you're prepared for the consequences." And it was gone. Silence fell. Gradually, Alphonse got used to the pain in his chest from the vampire's blow. He counted it good fortune that he'd only lost his breath and not broken any bones. so that he could still post on r/neverbrokeabone. With a final steadying wheeze, he hoisted the unconscious Luca on his back and rose slowly to his feet. I guess that's not the end of our vampire then, he said unhappily. Rose was inspecting her sword for damage. Finding none, she returned it to its sheath. Turning their body to mist is one of the many abilities vampires have. It escaped us from this time, but I expect that it will take some days for its left arm to heal. At the very least, I think it's safe to assume that no one else will be attacked tonight. Sounds like vampires are unbelievable foes to be up against. That's a relief though, at least. Still, he added, you're pretty unbelievable yourself. Seriously, why the hell did you give me a sword that don't work? Rose shook her head. Their loss obviously rankled her. Next time, she said with steel in her voice. It won't get away. I'm going to find some stronger equipment, and I will finish it for good. Alphonse nodded. Next time, they would have it. They might not have been able to defeat the vampire, but at the very least, they had earned a short respite from danger, having saved Luca and prevented another murder from occurring. And without Rose's assistance, none of it would have been possible. Thank you, Rose. If you hadn't been here, she cut him off with a dismissive wave of the hand. There's no reason to thank me. I was simply doing my duty. Dejected, Alphonse fell silent. But these murders are not over yet. We will need to discover the true identity of the vampire for that to happen. Yeah, he said at length. You're right. Either way, we should go and investigate another crime scene tomorrow, like we discussed earlier. Indeed. Farewell for now. And with that, she left. She didn't even wait for Alphonse's response, a fact that left him feeling even more downhearted, considering all they had been through that night. Afterwards, Alphonse took Luca to her home. As she walked, she finally woke up. Finding herself on his back, she flushed and stammered her way through his questions. She remembered nothing of what had happened to her, it seemed. Unable to tell the truth, Alphonse simply said that he found her collapsed outside. It was probably just fatigue from work, he told her. Thankfully, she seemed convinced. After a while, as he tried to feign cheerfulness and to put her at ease, his mind was still focused on the battle earlier. He hadn't stood a chance against the vampire. He had even forgotten the silver short sword that Rose had given him. Oh, okay. He just used the wrong sword? Alphonse, bro! Sword that Rose had given him. In the heat of the battle, he had simply fallen back on his military training and used his saber, for all the good that had done. While he had at least been able to avoid getting in Rose's way, he felt ashamed as an Imperial soldier. Next time, he swore to himself, he would not let her down. He would help bring an end to the murders once and for all. As Alphonse hardened his resolve that night, Rose navigated the dark streets alone, her mind fixated on the past, the sight of Alphonse on the ground after being struck by the vampire, the image of his friend who had lost her life and been turned into a ghoul, the vision of that one cursed memory she desperately sought to forget. Am I on the verge of making the same mistake a second time? She wondered aloud. She stopped in her tracks, brow furrowed, expression meek, and looked up to where the crimson moon hung like a great malevolent eye in the sky. Guys, what's up with the moon? Why can't the moon be normal? You know? I like my moons when they are not blood red. Is that a hot take? So let's water up real quick and get on to chapter 5. The kind of third waypoint, maybe? Because there's 15? Is there 15 chapters or are there 14? How many are there? Yeah, there's 14. I couldn't remember if it was 14 in a finale or if it was 14 in a finale. Chapter 5, Farewell. So this is the culprit behind the vampire murders, you say? Ron peered at the sketch, brows drawn down. The morning after Alphonse and Rose had fought the vampire, he'd made sure to report the fact to Garand. The sketch Garand was studying had been outlined based on Alphonse's testimony. It depicted a figure dressed in all black with the upper face obscured. The portrait showed everything Alphonse could recall from the vampire's distinguishing features, and he hoped it would be helpful to the army's investigations. Naturally, he had left out the subject was actually a vampire and capable of turning himself into black smoke on a whim. Actually, it was mist. Having his commanding officer think him crazy would help no one. The purpose of the sketch was simply to try and help people watch out for the culprit, not to try and convince them of its true nature, after all. He did wish he could tell them the complete truth, if only to better prepare them for a potential encounter against the monster and help them more effectively hunt it. But he knew better than anyone that no ordinary human would be able to stand up to it. He had learned that much firsthand the previous night. Trying to fight the vampire would only lead to unnecessary fatalities, and organizing large teams to try and exterminate it could even lead to it hiding itself away, or worse, fleeing the capital and going elsewhere. As such, the best chance to defeat it once and for all seemed to lie with Rose. Durand straightened and fixed Alphonse with a concerned eye. Anyway, Al, I'm just glad that you and Luke are both alright. He then let out a relieved sigh, as if that genuinely was the most important thing to him. The description and portrait of the black-clad man would be used to encourage people to be more vigilant and watch out for the culprit. If a number of people going out at night were to decrease, the number of murders would likely decrease too. Durand tried to convince Alphonse to rest for the day, not least because he had been injured the previous night, but Alphonse had no intention of listening. He and Rose had already decided to meet up and investigate further, he insisted. Durand's brows descended once again at that. His parting words as Alphonse left his office were simply, "Just don't do anything to put yourself in unnecessary danger, alright?" While he was usually strict as a superior, it was obvious that he genuinely cared for him like a real son. A fact that Alphonse couldn't possibly be any more grateful for. Feeling newly motivated, he quietly muttered to himself, "I will stop these murders," as he walked towards the exit of the guardhouse. Just before he could set off his meeting with Rose, however, he encountered his fellow soldier, Elroy. The other man looked as glum as ever. Judging by his appearance, he had just finished morning's training. Beads of sweat ran down his face, and his hair was matted to his forehead. Despite this, he didn't seem the slightest out of breath. Elroy had always been that way. Though he never seemed to train more than Alphonse and the other team members, he always seemed significantly stronger and more capable than any of them. He was well aware of this fact too, and he seemed to have developed a sense of superiority because of it. I mean, is he the vampire? He could be the vampire. That's possible. Looking down his nose at the others was Elroy's signature move. Today seemed no different. He turned to Alphonse with a mocking smile on his face. So he ran to the culprit behind the so-called vampire murders, didn't you? It's either that, or he's just going to be like attacked by the vampire, and then Alphonse is going to save him, and they're going to be best friends forever. That's a little bit more of the standard trope, so I hope it's not that. Him being the vampire would be kind of cool. Yeah, I did. Elroy gave a contemptuous snort. Well, you're useless then, aren't you? Why didn't you catch him? This would all have been over if you had. As usual, Elroy wasted no time in trying to pick a fight with Alphonse, but this time he had no comeback. Elroy was right. If he hadn't been so weak, he would have been able to defeat the vampire and stop the murders the previous night. Seeing Alphonse's reaction to his provocation, Elroy folded his arms triumphantly. The commander might favor you, but I think it's about time you stop letting that get to your head and learned your place. Alphonse was about to retort when he noticed something. Elroy's left arm was wrapped tightly in several layers of bandages. Okay, that's a little too on the nose. What happened to your arm? Alphonse pointed to the bandages with his finger, and for a brief moment, Elroy seemed unsure how to respond. It's nothing, really. I just heard it in training earlier. Spouts of blood peeked through the bandages, making it clear it was a recent injury at the very least. Alphonse looked at the damage with concern. This is why I can't stand you. Apparently thrown off by his teammate's worry, Elroy gave an audible tut before walking away, leaving a slightly embarrassed Alphonse behind. I mean, that just seems like too on the nose, right? So maybe Elroy's not the vampire. They just want you to think that. While they were hardly on the best terms, Alphonse didn't bear any particular grudge against Elroy. It was clear that the same couldn't be said for the other man, but Alphonse had no idea what he had against him. Letting out a sigh, he returned his thoughts to the investigation at hand. Now wasn't the time to be thinking about Elroy. He had to focus. With a shake of the head, he opened the guardhouse door and set out to meet Rose. They had decided to continue their search where they left off. So it was at the scene of the fourth murder that Alphonse met Rose. Despite scouring the area as thoroughly as they could, however, they found nothing that would help them identify the criminal. Eventually, Rose stopped to think for a while before proposing that they make their way to the street, where they had encountered the vampire the previous night and searched the scene there. Alphonse agreed. It seemed like a completely different place during the day, with the still quiet that had marked the night had been replaced with cheerful chatter and the bustling of people examining the wares at the street stalls. Since the murders were known to happen at night, people seemed happy to go about their ordinary lives during the day without a worry in the world. Taking care to avoid standing out too much, they walked side by side around the street looking for potential leads. It's hard to believe we fought a vampire here last night. Rose's lips curled up slightly. Most would find it difficult enough to believe that vampires exist to begin with. I suppose that makes the existence of people like me who live to hunt these vampires more unbelievable still. Was that meant as a joke? Alphonse wondered. Unsure how to respond, he elected to remain silent. Unfazed, Rose set about analyzing the previous night's events. The scent given off of that vampire is the same as the one I sensed from all the other victims. At the very least, it seems we're beyond a doubt the vampire is the killer we've been searching for. His scent? Alphonse asked, before recalling that Rose had mentioned something similar earlier when they were trying to pursue the vampire the previous night. So if we follow that scent, we can find out who the vampire is? Rose shook her head. I'm afraid not. As I said before, vampires are only capable of using their powers at night. During the day, they're no different than ordinary humans, and accordingly, the scent that gives them away as being a vampire vanishes as well. They both knew that ideally the best way to defeat the vampire would be to strike during the day while it was unable to activate its powers, but without any clue as to who the vampire's identity, they didn't have any chance of doing so. Realizing anew just how difficult the work of a vampire hunter must be, Alphonse admired Rose for all the more for being able to cope with it. Nonetheless, we made contact with the vampire yesterday, and I believe that's a big step forward for this investigation. After all, the more fierce the battle, the greater the chances that one of the participants may leave behind some incriminating evidence. There's always the possibility that she may have seen something too. Alphonse assumed that the she was referring to was Luca. He made a reply, but Rose was no longer beside him. Turning around, he realized that she had stopped in her tracks some distance behind. Her face was as expressionless as ever, but her eyes were cast downwards, almost as if she was regretting something. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said briskly and moved on. "We should continue our search." They set about combing the streets for any remnants of their battle. At one point, Rose suggested that they split up to cover a wider area. But even after doing so and reconvening to discuss their findings, or lack thereof, they found themselves no closer to pinpointing the vampire's true identity than they were the previous day. The hour had grown late and the sun was beginning to slow its descent into the sky. The warm glow of its fading rays deepened the red hue of the bricks even as the shadows cast by their sturdy walls lengthened. Alphonse ground his teeth in frustration. All this searching, not a single result. Damn it! Rose said the vampire's powers had been increasing over time. The previous night's battle had shown that she was capable of competing with it for now, and that it was that fact that allowed them to save Luca. There was no guarantee that would always be the case if it continued to claim more victims and go stronger. In Alphonse's vexation over their lack of progress, Rose spoke. "Nothing will come from being too hasty. We each have our tasks. All we need to do is complete them." He nodded, knowing full well that she was right. But it was hard not to feel bitter about their lack of headway all the same, as he needed to go and report the results of the day's investigation to Garan. They agreed to part ways for the time being. Alphonse proposed they meet again at the tavern, like they had the previous day, but Rose refused his offer. "I'm afraid I have business I must attend to at the church." "Oh, okay. I was really hoping we'd be able to patrol and keep an eye out for the vampires again, though, since you're the only one who can sense its presence." Considering what had happened the previous night and the increasing occurrence of the murders, remaining vigilant for the vampires was of the utmost priority. Or at least that was Alphonse's thought on the matter. Rose didn't react to the disappointment in his trailing words. Instead, she merely replied that she'd watch out for it alone before excusing herself with a solemn farewell. There was a pause in which it seemed as she wanted to say something else, but then she curtsied deeply and disappeared from his sight. Alphonse watched her go with an uneasy feeling in his gut. Something seemed off about her behavior. Unable to work out what it was, however, he was left with no choice but to watch her walk away into the distance. That night, Alphonse made his way to the tavern. After giving his report to Garand, Rose may have refused his offer to meet there, but he still wanted to look in on Luca after what had happened to her the previous day. "Oh, hello, Alfie." Luca was quick to spot him, and she showed him to a seat at the empty counter. After squaring his earlier bill from the dinner with Rose with the tavern owner, Luca excitedly came over to take his order. Seeing her smile and chatter as energetically as ever, Alphonse felt relieved. He had been expecting and fearing a more subdued demeanor from her. Watching her, he couldn't help but think how close she had come to losing her life, and for a pathetic reason like feeding a vampire. Just the thought made his blood boil. Alfie, are you okay?" Her nervous question made him realize that his anger must be showing as an expression. He quickly put on an awkward smile and set about eating to avoid having to explain anything. After a few bites, he felt himself calming down and gave her a more genuine smile. "I'm fine, honestly. Never mind me. You haven't managed to recall anything about what happened last night, have you?" She shook her head. "Sorry, I wish I could, but I can't remember a thing." He really hadn't expected her to, but he was still sadly disappointed to not be able to gather any new information. Rose had speculated that the shock of seeing the vampire had caused her to subconsciously block out any memory of what had happened. As such, it didn't seem particularly likely that she would be able to help them find out the identity of the vampire. He sighed. Luca, meanwhile, was desperately trying to remember something, anything that would allow her to be of service to him. After mulling over it for a time, she suddenly let out an "ah" sound. It doesn't directly relate to what happened yesterday, but that person, was here earlier on her own too." Alphonse was momentarily puzzled. "Who do you mean?" Luca prompted with a swish of her hair. "The girl you were here with yesterday." It suddenly dawned on him who Luca was referring to, but Rose specifically told him that she wouldn't be coming to the tavern today because she had business with the church. A troubled feeling began to build in the pit of his stomach. Anyway, she just came and asked me a few things about yesterday. I couldn't remember anything when she asked either, but eventually she seemed satisfied and just said farewell and left." Farewell. The moment Alphonse heard those words, it dawned on him. Every time he parted ways with Rose, She always left with a farewell for now, but not today. When they separated earlier, she had instead simply said farewell. He had thought something seemed off about her at the time, and it was then that he realized that was the reason. After that, she must have come to the tavern where she was able to discover something from Luca, but if that were the case, what would she try and do next? Alphonse fairly jumped out of his seat. Half of the food still left on his plate, and dumped enough mirror to pay for the meal hurriedly onto the table. Al? Luca goggled at him. Just keep the change. It was this second feeling of great foreboding in 2 days, and the first had been downright deadly. He rushed out of the tavern as fast as his legs would carry him onto the streets of Heimdall. The sun had long since set, and the deeply shadowed streets welcomed him into their murky depths. Pretty ominous title name there, from being honest. I'm sure nothing will happen, right? Chapter 6. Bloodstained Rose. The city of Heimdall was deathly silent. During the day, word had spread throughout the populace from the Grand team regarding the culprit behind the vampire murders. Knowing specific details about the perpetrator instilled an even greater sense of fear into the people of the city, making them even more wary of stepping out of their homes at night. That the streets would be empty was an inevitability, and yet on one dark avenue in the city, a petite woman walked alone, as if to defy all of that. She wore a plain, undecorated dress and from all appearances belonged to the middle classes. She walked quite quickly, the sound of her shoes against the ground echoing loudly in the empty streets. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her chest, almost as if embracing herself, and she was hunched forward, clearly afraid of something. Of course, it was perfectly natural for her to be afraid, considering that the majority of the victims in the city's serial murderer were young women like herself. She looked around restlessly, carefully surveying her surroundings for signs of danger before disappearing down a dark alleyway. The faint moonlight illuminated her profile as she turned the corner and cast a long shadow behind her, which slowly and silently began to enlarge. Gradually, the silhouette extended upwards, the inky depth shaking the shape of a man had loomed behind her. The figure was swathed in all black, with the top half of its face covered. The bottom half remained exposed, revealing a wicked grin and sharp, pointed fangs. It was a vampire, a creature of legend. It stood silently behind the woman, very much real despite its supposedly mythological standing. From the sable folds of the cloak swaddling its body, it slowly extended a pale hand. The fingers stretched forward, sharp, pointed nails gently swept aside the woman's shoulder-length blonde hair. The tips brushed the back of her neck, almost caressingly. The second they did, though, it seemed to sense that something was wrong. Its prey was behaving oddly. It hadn't expected the frail creature before it to put up the slightest resistance. It should have frozen at its touch, or given into despair, having no choice but to succumb to the inevitable and have her blood drained. What it felt from her instead, however, was defiance and danger. This woman was no prey. Hunter had met hunter. The creature tensed, ready to leap backwards. Too late it realized another threat radiated from directly behind it. There was no avoiding it. The sound of paving stones cracking resounded in the still night, and its outstretched right arm was suddenly shredded by numerous sharp objects. The vampire let out an involuntary hiss of pain as a wave of silver blades arced through the air and flesh, one after another. The attack wasn't over. The vampire sensed danger from below too, and the blades which impaled into the ground suddenly arced upwards with alarming speed, as if retracing their path through the air. Just as the blades were about to sever its right arm from its body once and for all, it was able to jump out of the way. Clutching its mangled limb, the vampire edged further back to put distance between itself and the woman, and watched balefully with narrowed eyes as the razor-sharp segments that had pierced its sword back over to the bladeless handle of the woman's hand. When she had drawn it, it didn't know. Connected by sturdy steel wires, the segments interlocked one by one, eventually forming a complete blade known as a Templar sword. She swung it, shaking the blood from its surface. Every last trace of the weakness she had shown earlier when hurrying through the night was gone. She turned around, finally revealing the dignified, expressionless face that had laid on the other side of the sleek, blonde curtain of hair. It was the vampire hunter, Rose. "You were trying to lure me out, were you?" the vampire sneered. Such cunning." Its words were sharp, but the delivery fell somewhat tremulously on the rough cobblestones of the empty alley. "You flatter me," Rose said. Her Templar sword still raised in her right hand, she put her left hand into her pocket and pulled out an unbelievably large caliber pistol, greater in size than those used in the army. She asked him if he was feeling lucky, punk. She aimed it at the vampire's forehead and pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation. The gunpowder flash illuminated the alleyway briefly, and a single blessed silver bullet flew from the muzzle with merciless intent. Such was the force of the discharge that an ordinary person's shoulder would have been dislocated, but Rose didn't so much as twitch. The vampire moved with liquid speed, dodging the projectile just in time and slipping behind Rose. Not the slightest perturbed by its change in direction, Rose moved as well and kept the pistol focused on the creature, tracking the vampire's every movement. "You're quite adept at fleeing, if nothing else," she said coolly. "Would you prefer that I did something like this, then?" the vampire asked. As it spoke, it fluttered the black garment it was draped in, and then began to expand, the folds stretching to impossible size before her eyes. Pitiful moans echoed in the dark depths. Rose watched with narrow eyes as a number of ghouls crawled out from within, as if emerging from thin air. 5, 6, 7. Eventually she counted 10 in all. It hadn't even been 24 hours since the previous battle. The vampire couldn't have possibly attacked that many people in this time. Rose's mouth tightened. "I see. And here we believe the reported murders to be the only victims. That wasn't the case at all. You were abducting others who had no living relatives to notice that they were gone and keeping them locked up somewhere, weren't you?" "Precisely. With the vampire hunter on the loose, I had to make sure I had some food in reserve. I'd rather not run the risk of going hungry, you see." "The very thought makes me feel physically ill," Rose replied quietly. With a vicious yank, she tore the dress she had worn as a disguise from her body. Underneath it, sturdy leather clothes designed with the mobility in mind were revealed. Attached to them were numerous belts holding large guns, knives, and other anti-vampire weaponry in place. It was clear at a glance that she was well prepared for battle. The sight of Rose's arsenal coaxed a sickly smile from the vampire. "Go forth, my minions," and with a wave of its pallid hand, the ghouls leaped forward. "Where are you, Rose?" Alphonse shouted between pants as he ran back and forth across the city, desperately searching for her. Try as he might, though, he could find no sign of the blonde woman. Even his fellow soldiers patrolling the streets had seen nothing. Alphonse had a very specific reason for pursuing this case, and he didn't intend to lose this opportunity to put the past behind him. That was what led him to propose that he and Rose work together. A proposal which he had accepted, and yet despite all that, she was trying to fight the vampire all on her own. It was too risky even for her. His mind was full of worry, and that fear conjured forth the image of his parents' dead bodies. Never again. He never wanted to see a sight like that again. Wishing over and over again that Rose was still alright, he raced on. It was then that he heard a sound that caught his attention, the clash of battle. As soon as the noise reached his ears, he quickly surveyed his surroundings. The source seemed to be an alleyway nearby. Without a thought spared for his own safety, he charged into the alleyway. There, an unbelievable sight met his eyes. 2 ghouls lunged at her. Sheathing her Templar sword into its scabbard, Rose drew a second large pistol in its place. The ghouls swung their fists and ragged nails towards her with inhuman power, but she dodged them gracefully. As she spun out of their range, she aimed one pistol at each ghoul's forehead and pulled the trigger simultaneously. Flesh and bone were obliterated instantly. The sheer force of the blast sent the mangled remains somersaulting backwards through the air. The move left Rose slightly unbalanced, and, as if seeking to take advantage of that, 3 more ghouls flew at her from outside her field of vision. The mere sound of their movement was enough to alert her, however, and without even turning to face them, she sent 2 more bullets through the heads of the 2 ghouls charging from her sides. The third ghoul's mouth distended, seeking to crush Rose's skull with its teeth, but she danced out of reach, holstering the pistols. Fluidly, she then flipped back through the air, drawing a Templar sword at the same time and slicing the lower half of the ghoul's body from the upper half in one swift stroke. She landed gracefully and kicked the ghoul she had just cut in half out of the way, without even waiting for its body to hit the ground. 2 more ghouls approached from the fringes, but without waiting for them to draw closer this time, she swung her blade horizontally through the air. It splintered to pieces and the countless segmented parts pierced the ghouls' neck. Their heads dropped to the ground like fruit falling from a tree. 7 of the ghouls incapacitated in what seemed like an instant. Rose turned her attention to the defiantly grinning vampire and the remaining 3 ghouls with him. She drew the 2 pistols from her waist a second time and sprinted towards them, showering them with the remaining loaded bullets. The vampire invaded the projectiles by using the remaining ghouls as shields. Out of bullets, Rose drew her Templar sword and swung it in the direction of the vampire's neck in one fluid motion, seeking to decapitate it. The next instant, the high-pitched screech of metal against metal filled the air. The vampire had drawn its own weapon from inside the black garments. It met Rose's blade in midair. The 2 swords locked against one another, filling the air with sparks and leaving them in a stalemate, reminiscent of the previous night's battle. I'm impressed at how unfazed you seem to be fighting against these ghouls, the vampire said, teeth bared but with a slight curl to its lips. I would have expected a human to at least hesitate when being forced to fight against their own kind. They ceased to be my kind the moment you drank their blood. They're nothing but soulless puppets now. Why should I hesitate against them? The creature inclined its head almost respectfully at that. You certainly think like a vampire hunter. The sound of metal against metal continued to reverberate throughout the area. Drinking the blood of the ghouls had allowed the vampire to become even stronger than the previous night. Its once crippled right arm had already healed and regained its original form. Even so, Rose met it without any sign of strain, her strength matching that of the fell creature before her. They're screaming, dude. A loud war cry split the air, startling the combatants, and a third figure burst into the scene. The charging figure was dressed in an army uniform and brandished a silver sword. It was Alphonse. Catching the vampire off guard, he slashed at its side. Having no experience of the weapon itself, it was a shallow attack, and the damage it dealt far from lethal. But it was enough to break the stalemate. Seizing the opening, Rose forcefully knocked the vampire's sword out of the way, and one flowing motion slashed horizontally from its exposed chest to its left arm. A crimson gout of blood arced from the wound, splashing the cobblestones. Something also sheared off within the vampire's garments and flew into the air. The vampire clutched its chest in pain, but it seemed clear that the attack had only grazed it. It seemed that once again, the creature's preternatural speed had saved it from mortal injury. Eyes darting from one to another, it backed away with an audible tisk. Seems like the odds are stacked against me. I won't shoot for today, it said. Its outline growing dim before it turned into mist and vanished into nothingness. After a moment of heavy silence, Alphonse sheathed his sword, staring at the spot where the vampire had previously been. It got away again. Fine look at him. Rose let out a sigh of disbelief. Why did you come? Hearing the coldness in her voice, Alphonse lost his composure. He seized her shoulder in his hands. Of course I came, he yelled. What were you thinking trying to fight him on your own? It's too dangerous to take him out without any help. Her cool blue eyes locked with his. Dangerous? For me? Do you honestly believe that? She asked. Her face was as mask-like as ever, but her tone had dropped from chilly to downright glacial. It had a cooling effect on Alphonse's anger. He took a half step back and looked at her from the top to the bottom. Illuminated by the light of the moon, he could see that she was covered in gore. He released her shoulders and stared down at his own hands. They too were now wet with the blood from touching her. And yet, there was not so much as a scratch on her whole body. The filth covering her entire body belonged to the ghoul she had defeated. I am a vampire hunter, and this is not the first vampire I've hunted. I've killed more than you could even possibly imagine. Alphonse couldn't deny what she was saying. She had seen for himself the skill and grace she had shown when mercilessly slaying all those ghouls, unmoved by the fact they were once humans. He had been an artist in battle, and the sword her paintbrush. What he had witnessed was beyond his comprehension. A struggle between monsters rather than human beings. That was why he could do nothing but stand and watch. At first, unable to intervene, he was lost for words. Rose broke the silence with a short, frosty laugh. Al, I have no further need of your assistance. I suggest you forget all about this and return to your ordinary life. He then gave a respectful curtsy, much like the one she had when they first met. Yeah, I think I'm about to stop because I'm getting like real dry mouth from doing all this. I'll probably come back probably tomorrow at this point because it's kind of late in the day, and finish this up. Still be the same, just one long video, but I'm actually kind of enjoying it, like more than I thought. It's my only real. It is a little long-winded. It'd be really the only complaint, but it is kind of cool. It goes into more detail, which is kind of nice. Like the Carnelia stuff, for example, is like almost a little too short to the point, like when it's doing its fight scenes, so to speak. Whereas, you know, the Blood Moon Rose is maybe like a little too detailed and long-winded. They could just find like a happy medium between the two. That'd be good. But yeah, overall, I'm enjoying the first half, and we'll see how it progresses in a little bit. Alright, so we're back. It's been a couple days since we read the first half of the book, which does mean that this is the first video being recorded after the finale went up. It's just kind of interesting, I suppose. Which was kind of a mixed bag of a video. Got a lot of very nice, kind, encouraging comments, but it's also the most disliked Trails video I've ever put out. So that's something that I didn't really expect. I don't know. It's something that I kind of do. I guess I'll have to address in the discussion video some, but I guess I just kind of wanted to mention it because it's on my mind this morning after waking up. But yeah, let's get back into Red Moon Rose. Now, was 7 the last one we did? Or wait, was 6 the last one we did? 'Cause I don't remember this. I think 6 was the last one we did. Yeah, wow, I thought we were further in. Oh, guys, it's so dang long. Alright, let's get started. Chapter 7, Parting of the Ways. I still have no further need of your assistance. His mind still reeling from the skill that Rose had demonstrated in her earlier battle. The only way he could react to her words was with dumbfounded silence. There were plenty of ways he could have argued back, not least by pointing out that they had yet to discover the vampire's identity, and that the reason she had originally agreed that they work together was so that he could use his position in the army to aid her in doing so. As if reading his mind, she said, "I discovered the identity of the vampire this afternoon. As such, there's no longer anything you can do to help me." His initial reaction was doubt. How could she have possibly been the only one to discover the vampire's identity when they had conducted their investigation together? Alphonse, maybe you're not smart. But then it hit him. They hadn't always been together. They had split up to investigate a wider area today, too. And if she had discovered a vital clue during the period where they were acting separately, it made perfect sense that only she would have worked out the truth. He tried again, but still, I have my reasons for wanting to see this through to the end, too. I can't just go back to living as nothing has ever happened. Rose knew this already, of course. He had told her about his parents' murder once already and made her realize that the two cases might be connected. She sighed, her reaction making it perfectly clear that pointing that out would do nothing to change her mind. She met his eyes again, unwavering in the slightest, and she said, "Then allow me to put my position to you more bluntly. You're not a help, you are a hindrance." It was as if a sharp blade had pierced his chest. Her words left him shocked and speechless. She continued, "I would have thought that anyone who looked around would be able to realize that this is not a matter that ordinary people can or should involve themselves in." As she spoke, she gestured in the direction of the ghouls, or rather human corpses that were once ghouls littering the surrounding area. Some were riddled with bullet holes, some had smashed skulls, some had no heads at all. The words caused Alphonse's memories to return once again to the battle he had witnessed. Even if he had tried to intervene earlier than he did, would he have been able to do anything? No. On the contrary, it was easy to imagine him getting in Rose's way, becoming a liability, and interfering with her ability to fight. Alphonse looked down at the ground dejectedly. It was galling to hear, and realizing that he might be useless in this, Rose opened her mouth to continue, her gaze somewhat distant. "A long time ago, I tried to pursue another vampire with the help of a civilian just like you. I was hesitant at first, but after he insisted so vehemently, I agreed." Alphonse looked up, stunned at what he was hearing. He had assumed that he was the first person to offer to assist her. He was killed by the vampire we were pursuing. After that, the vampire disappeared, never to be seen again. It was clear by the pain in her voice that for someone whose life revolved around killing vampires, there could have been no worse outcome. Of all the jobs I've undertaken, that was my worst failure and my most terrible stain on my record. So I will not allow something like that to happen again. As such, I have always tried to keep you at arm's length. All I wanted from you was for you to make it easier for me to conduct my investigation and find out what I wanted to know. I was just using you all along. She continued on, telling him that everything had gone the way she had hoped it would. Perhaps even better. Thanks to his contribution, she had been able to discover the identity of the vampire, and the army was able to find out what it looked like, helping them to keep people off the streets and allowing her to successfully lure the vampire out. For that, at the very least, she was grateful. Alphonse could only stand and listen as her cold words washed over him, the meaning of what she was actually saying not truly sinking in. He fell silent for a moment and took a deep breath before starting again. The worlds we live in are just too different. We never should have met, and yet by coincidence we did, but that's all. I need you to forget about all that has happened and go back to the life you should have always lived. Besides, the vampire hunter, the only life for me is one of solitude. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile before turning to walk away from him. Seeing that smile and hearing what she said, something struck Alphonse as off, and yet he could not call out to her. It was as if there were an impenetrable wall between them now, stopping him from interacting any further with her. "I can take care of everything by myself now. All I ask of you is to stay away and let me do it. Farewell." She said her final words as she walked, without so much as turning to face him, and then disappeared. Into the dark night left behind, Alphonse stood alone, frozen to the spot in a sea of blood. The next day, 10 unidentified bodies were discovered in Heimdall, and the surrounding area filled with disorder, the likes of which had never been seen before. Numerous soldiers moved to and fro, surveying the area under Garon's direction, while crowds of curious onlookers tried to get a closer look at the gruesome display. Even Alphonse, who had been removed from the main investigation team, had been called in to assist this time. Alphonse had expected the bodies to be heavily disfigured from Rose's attacks, but when he reached the scene, he could see no evidence whatsoever that the previous night's battle had even taken place. The only marks on the bodies were the bite marks left by the vampire. That's weird. At first that fact confused him, but then he remembered that Rose was somehow connected to the church. It seemed quite possible then that she would have worked alongside others, one or more of whom may have been able to arrive later to disguise any evidence of their involvement. I mean, I guess they can do that. After all, the church had the ability to purify weapons to allow them to contend with vampires. The possibility they might also be able to put corpses back together was hardly a stretch after all. The things he had witnessed. I mean, it's a bit different, you know, blessing a weapon and being like, I make this skull back in one piece! Realizing how ludicrous that would sound to the average person, he only laughed to himself under his breath. There was no sign of Rose at the scene. Although Alphonse hadn't really expected that she would appear to begin with, she made it clear the previous night that their original arrangement was over. Most likely Rose had gone to bring an end to the vampire murders herself in secret, with the culprit never apprehended, and the fact that vampires actually existed never being revealed to the world. But could he live with everything ending that way? There was still one burning doubt in Alphonse's heart, a lingering unease that refused to go away. The expression on her face as she turned to walk away. The vampire hunter, the only life for me is one of solitude. That may have been what she said, but the sad smile on her lips when she did so told a different story. Coolness underlined with resignation. Her words had been blunt, but to Alphonse they had also seemed tinged with loneliness. Alphonse found himself reflecting on what that loneliness meant to him. It was a feeling he was all too familiar with after losing his parents. In the blink of an eye, he had been left with no one who cared for him, no one who would be kind to him, no one who would look out for him. It was easy to imagine how being placed in a situation like that would gradually eat away at a person. Fortunately for Alphonse, his father's friend Garand had helped him out, held out a hand of salvation to him, and he had later met others like Luca who cared for him and he for them. It was thanks to them that he was able to free himself of the loneliness that may have otherwise consumed him. Nonetheless, the experience had taught him exactly how painful living like that could be, and that humans could not completely live alone. Rose, however, had said that living in solitude was the only life for her. But did she honestly mean that? Or did she really long to break free of it, yet something was stopping her from doing so? With the memory of his experience still painful even after all these years, Alphonse couldn't stop wondering. That was when he made up his mind. He wouldn't just leave things as they were. Rose may have cast them aside, but he had long ago decided that he needed to put the past behind him. No matter how much danger he risked doing so, or how much he tried to stop him, he was determined to see it through to the end. If that meant he might be a hindrance to her, so be it. This was his fight, as much as hers. Alphonse shook his head furiously from side to side, as if to disinvest himself from the doubts and hesitations that had been filling his mind since the previous night. Focusing on the task at hand, he set about frantically investigating the area that he felt was the only way for him to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. Time dragged on as the search continued, and the receding rays of the setting sun began to blanket the scene in warm apricot hues. The 10 corpses had been carried away, and the vast majority of onlookers had dispersed. A large number of soldiers who formed the investigation team had also reached a stopping point in their investigation, and were ready to return for the day, but Alphonse waved them off, still silently combing the area for clues. Come on now, it's time to go back to the guardhouse for the day. The concern in Garand's voice was obvious, but Alphonse only spared him a tired smile. Sorry, sir, just let me look around for a bit longer. Considering the intense battle fought between Rose and the vampire the previous night, there was every chance that something may have been left behind that might help guide him to the vampire's identity. The investigation team had found no such thing despite spending the entire day looking, but that did nothing to dampen Alphonse's spirits. There was something here, he knew it. Seeing Alphonse's determination, Garand couldn't help but smile in return. Alright, then have it your way. Just make sure you stop and come back if you get too tired. And with a backwards wave, he walked off to join the other soldiers as they returned to the guardhouse. Finally thanking Garand for his kindness, Alphonse went back to scouring the alleyway. Another half hour passed while Alphonse methodically swept his eyes over every nook and cranny. As the light from the dipping sun retreated from the sky, he began to fear his time was up. Just then his eyes were drawn to a point between two of the buildings. It was a narrow gap overlooked in the investigation where something might have fallen. Indeed, he spied the barest of shapes on the ground. Upon spotting it, Alphonse remembered seeing something fly from the vampire when Rose had landed her glancing slash on its chest. He crouched down to inspect the space. The gap between the buildings was so narrow that his arm could barely fit inside. He stretched out his fingers, desperately trying to reach the fallen object, and eventually managed to catch it between his index and middle fingers. It was a narrow, rectangular piece of cloth. Alphonse stared at it, analyzing every last detail on its surface. It was a filthy gray in color, most likely meaning that it had been white originally. It was also clear that it had been separated from something by Rose's sword. But other than that, it looked like an ordinary piece of cloth. It would have been nothing of interest to anyone at all just passing by. Anyone other than Alphonse, that is. Looking at it, he finally understood everything. Reese and Rose had suddenly chosen to part ways with him, and the true identity of the vampire who was terrorizing the city. So is it really just the dude? Kind of not the most interesting twist, if I'm being honest. Well, I mean, it would have been fine if they hadn't, like, force-fed it to you, assuming that is what they're going for here. Chapter 8. The Truth. The stillness of night came once again to the streets of Heimdall. A bewitching yet eerie red moon hung in the sky, its carmine glow staining the red bricks of the surrounding buildings in even deeper crimson. Bro, why doesn't nobody mention that the moon is consistently red at night? Seems like a bit of a problem. After the gruesome discovery of the bodies that day, the Garan team had strengthened its nighttime patrols. Most of the soldiers in the team were on the streets, determined to prevent any further violence and repair the damage to the Imperial Army's honor. The patrol routes had them making tight circuits of the city, diligently searching for anything out of order. One particularly dark street corner, a block away from the Allegria Tavern, stood a young man in a military uniform. Much like the others, he was making the rounds in his thoroughly deserted patrol area. A figure turning onto the street just ahead of him made him pause mid-step. Warily, he put his hands on the sword at his waist. As the figure drew closer, the features gradually became more visible. It was another soldier, like himself. It was Alphonse. Alphonse stepped forward and stood silently before the young man. He fixed him with an unwavering gaze. "Oh, it's you," the young man said, sounding annoyed. "What are you doing here? This is my patrol area, not yours." He glared at Alphonse with intense dislike, but Alphonse did not look away. "I came to ask you something," Alphonse replied simply. He put his hands in his pocket and took something out of it. It was a dirty piece of cloth. The other man looked puzzled. What's that supposed to be? It was something I found in the area where the vampire appeared last night. It's also yours, isn't it, Elroy? Elroy stared back at Alphonse, then rolled his eyes. His voice dripped with contempt. "What are you talking about? Do you really abandon your post over some rag? Over who some rag might belong to? And vampire, you're supposed to be a soldier, not some kind of superstitious lunatic," he scoffed. "This is part of the bandage you were wearing around your left arm when you said you were injured in training," Alphonse said calmly. The cloth, Alphonse continued, must have been cut from his bandage during the previous day's battle, and ended up between the two buildings in an area they neglected to check. He didn't however mention who had done the cutting. There was no need to tell. Elroy information that he already knew, after all. Hearing this, Elroy clutched his left arm, hidden under the sleeve of his army uniform, almost as if trying to hide it from Alphonse. Besides, the idea that you were injured badly enough to need a bandage like this in standard training makes no sense to begin with. You're the most skilled swordsman on the Grand team, after all. That's not to say that you weren't actually injured, especially considering there really was fresh blood on the bandage itself. But you didn't injure yourself during training. You were stabbed by a rapier, and that was what the bandage was intended to disguise. Elroy said nothing. Under any other circumstances, he would have been quick to argue back. But not this time. His brow furrowed, and he glared angrily at Alphonse. Also, Alphonse, buddy, pal, friend, guy. Why the fuck you confronting him at night? Bro, come on, use your noggin, man. I'm sure you must have replaced the bandage with a new one last night, but then, what was this doing at the scene of the crime? You weren't involved in this morning's investigation. Alphonse is aware that what he was saying wouldn't be enough to prove to the world that Elroy was a vampire. They were, after all, creatures of legend. People never believed him. What it did prove, however, was that Elroy had been where Rose and the vampires' battle took place, and considering that Alphonse already knew the vampires were no mere myth, that was all the proof he needed. I don't want to believe it myself. I can't bear to think that someone who has served alongside as a soldier might be someone more skilled than any of us. Is actually a monster who's been indiscriminately murdering people? Elroy made no reply. He just stared down at the ground, silent and tense. But I am a member of the Garan team, Alphonse continued resolutely, and we are entrusted with the task of protecting this city. I have a duty to do what I can to prevent any more lives from being lost unless you can prove what I'm saying isn't true. I'm going to have to arrest you as a suspect. Hands at his side, Elroy let out a short, quiet laugh. The second he did, something changed and the atmosphere became oppressive. Elroy threw back his head and let out a loud, maniacal laugh. It was an inhuman sound, that outburst. The skin-crawling utterance was entirely unlike the usual quiet Elroy. As his mouth yawned wide, Alphonse saw what he knew he would, beast-like fangs, the fangs of a vampire. Once again, why you confront him at night? Alphonse placed his hands on the saber at his waist and drew it as fast as he could. The sound of blade scraping against scabbard cut short the awful laugh, but it wasn't fast enough. Before he knew it, Elroy was right in front of him, swinging his own sword with incredible force. Alphonse barely had the time to block its arc with his own. The sound of metal against metal filled the air, and the monstrous strength of the blow pushed Alphonse backwards. It was obvious to him that Elroy's power was vastly greater than it had been when he took the punch to the stomach several days before. If Elroy had been this strong that day, Alphonse knew he would already be dead. Barely managing to hold his position, he clung to a saber with his now somewhat numb hand, but the vampire was already drawing back for another strike. Planting his feet firmly on the ground, Alphonse was just able to parry the blow, but it was all he could manage. If he strayed even a hair from focusing on defense, he would soon be overwhelmed. Elroy meanwhile maintained his onslaught seemingly without effort. Blow after blow rained down relentlessly. You should have waited, Alphonse. Surely you know that vampires can lose their powers at night. Alphonse grunted. I assume he has a plan, right? Grunted as he narrowly deflected another attack. Naturally, he did know. He was fully aware that waiting until morning might have actually given him a chance to defeat Elroy. But he just couldn't bring himself to wait. Not when there was a possibility that he might have claimed another victim that night. I can kind of respect that, but it's also kind of dumb. His conscience wouldn't allow him to sleep peacefully in his bed, knowing that he could have done something to stop the murder from happening. As if to punctuate his point, Elroy knocked the saber from Alphonse's hands with a vicious swipe that drove him to his knees. The blade clattered down on the paving stones far from his fighting pair. "You're finished," Elroy crowed, turning his sword on Alphonse. The blade flashed up, then descended. Alphonse watched the fall of the sword as if in slow motion. He knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. It would bite through his flesh and send his head soaring through the air, much like his saber had just done. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistling sound of something moving very fast cut through the night, and then another and another followed. The next moment, Elroy's right arm was gone. Blood speckled Alphonse's cheeks like a fine rain. And just as he had imagined, something soared through the air and hit the ground, but instead of it being his head, it was Elroy's right arm. The sword still clutched in his rigid fingers. Elroy instinctively jumped back, clutching at his wounded limb while Alphonse stared wide-eyed at the many parts of the Templar sword stretched before him, like the flexing of a metal snake. Wires connecting the razor-sharp blade segments gleamed in the moonlight. A line of tension that ran through the wires, and they all retracted just as fast as they had appeared. Soon after, a long figure approached to take their place. It was a woman in a navy blue coat that was thrown wide, exposing countless weapons attached to the battle gear she was wearing underneath. She had sleek, shoulder-length blonde hair capped by a navy blue beret. The look she gave Alphonse when she saw him was somewhere between exasperation and belief. Alphonse smiled weakly. "What took you so long, Rose?" We got 6 more? Alright. And they're all, oh god, they all long, dude. Alright. So water up and get back at it. Chapter 9. A Fool. "So you showed up after all, did you, vampire hunter?" Elroy glared at Rose, teeth clenched in anger and pain. Red smoke was rising from his now amputated right arm. It gave off a faint hissing sound. Rose turned her attention from Alphonse to him. She raised her Templar sword and stared back, without expression, at her target. Elroy glowered back. They both maintained a distance from one another, each trying to work out what the other would do next. Without taking her eyes off Elroy, Rose addressed Alphonse. "I told you not to get involved in this any further, and yet despite that, you tried to fight a vampire alone. I cannot believe you would do something so foolish." "I can." Their words were tinged with anger. Alphonse rose unsteadily to his feet. "You were the one who tried to fight him alone first, and besides, I never had any intention of seriously trying to defeat him myself." "What?" He faced her and spread his hands. "I was pinning all my hopes on you coming for me." "And you did, just like when we first met." Alphonse's response seemed to catch Rose completely off guard. He could tell as much from his position behind her. She quickly regained her composure, though, and the wavering sword steady. I don't know what you're trying to say." "You told me that you didn't want to work with me anymore because I was getting in your way, because there was nothing more that I could help you with, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is you didn't want to put me in any more danger. You didn't want me to lose my life helping you like the last person you worked with did." "That is just idle speculation," she replied coolly. But Alphonse knew he was right. "Then why did you lie about discovering the vampire's true identity?" "So you noticed." It hadn't taken much effort to see through her lie. Rose herself had said the vampires are only capable of unleashing their powers at night, meaning the best way to defeat one was to discover their true identity and kill them during the day. And yet despite that, Rose had gone to the effort of trying to lure the vampire out, taking the great risk of using herself as bait. Logically, her actions made no sense whatsoever if she had known the true identity of the creature. Deliberately lowering her chances of success wasn't like Rose at all. "I imagine you noticed something else during our investigation," Alphonse continued. I didn't know whatever it was that made you think that letting me cooperate with you any longer would put my life in danger, and that was why you lied. In order to try and keep me away from that danger. Rose didn't react, but also didn't deny his words. To Alphonse, that was the same as an admission. Enough of this, the vampire before them opened his eyes wide and began to concentrate his power. The moment it did, the red smoke that had been rising from the stump where its arm had been was replaced with a jet of liquescent black ichor. It had bubbled and frothed from an open wound. He's an Namekian, dude. On the cobblestone some distance away, the arm itself also began to expel the same noxious-looking secretion. Suddenly, the black liquid, from both stump and severed limbs, stretched and pulled, seeking out the other. No! Knowing what was about to happen, Rose quickly swung her Templar sword in the direction of the liquid. The sword's countless parts sliced through it, but the dark matter just reformed around the damage. Moments later, the liquid had done its work, and the severed right arm was back where it belonged. As good as new. How could he recover so quickly? I knew it, he really is a... Elroy swung the sword with his newly attached arm at Rose. Calm as ever, she pointed her Templar sword at him, and fired the bladed segments that formed it. They flew from the handle and wrapped around it, binding and tearing simultaneously. Before they completely ensnare him, however, Elroy transmuted into mist. The blades of the Templar sword fell from the spot he had been in as the mist dispersed. It reconverged a moment later at a point just behind the vampire hunter. No sooner had the mist solidified than Elroy swung the sword. His attack caught her completely off guard, decapitating her. Or so he expected, but Alphonse blocked it, his saber back in hand. Alphonse gritted his teeth, desperately trying to hold his ground. Elroy had the clear advantage in terms of strength, but try as he might, he could not break Alphonse's guard. How many times do you have to get in my way before you're satisfied? Cried Elroy. Ow! Wait, what? Oh, it did skip. Seeing a chance, Rose drew one of her giant pistols and, holding it in a black-handed grip, pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped through Elroy's shoulder, repelling him backwards. Alphonse steadied himself and ready to saber again. I won't die on you, Rose. I'm not going to let some vampire kill me, so... Can this not wait? Rose aimed her pistol, resting it on Alphonse's shoulder, and fired it repeatedly at Elroy. His wound already fully healed, Elroy dodged all the bullets with snake-like grace, and flew at them with great speed. 1 second. Alright, I'm back. Rose's pistol was now empty of bullets, and the vampire's charge gave her no time to draw the other. Elroy swung his sword at them as if trying to cut them both down in a single stroke. Alphonse brought his own saber to bear and raised it with all his might to block the path of the falling sword. The two blades collided with such force that Alphonse's saber was sheared in two. The collision repelled Elroy as well, but if he were to swing his sword downwards a second time with the same level of force, Alphonse and Rose... This is actually like the way this combat is, I'm interrupting it, but like the way it's not positioned, but done is really cool. Like the idea of her being right behind him and using like his shoulder to shoot the pistol is pretty neat visual image. No chance of surviving. The vampire's lips curled up in a smile, sensing impending victory. That smile was rebalanced almost immediately by shock when he saw what Alphonse had drawn from the depths of his uniform. Alphonse had expected that his saber would not survive Elroy's attack, and had immediately reached for the silver short sword given to him by Rose. I'm never going to allow you to be alone again, he cried, out as he swung the silver sword downward across Elroy's body, a trail of glittering argent light followed in its wake. Elroy recoiled backwards, clawing at his chest. Alphonse's attack had missed his heart, but the damage it had done was the greatest he had received yet. How could I have wounded the likes of him? Damn you, damn you, damn you, damn you! Elroy's expression was one of pure hatred mixed with intense agony. There wasn't a trace of humanity left on his face. Alphonse, meanwhile, had exhausted the last of his strength at that attack, and was on his knees out of breath. Rose stared down at him, a peculiar look on her face. Alphonse was desperately trying to accept and understand her solitude. He recognized that intense loneliness she had been burdened with when she let her companion die all those years ago, and was trying to save her from it. The words, "I'm never going to allow you to be alone again," resounded in her head over and over. She knew that what she said was purely based on emotion, but it was enough to fill her heart with warmth, a heart that she had thought had long gone cold. You really are a complete fool, she laughed. The sound of her laughing so naturally was enough to make Alphonse snap around to stare at her. But perhaps that isn't such a bad thing after all. Hey Rose, that's cool and all, but the vampire, you got your sword. What if you just were to fucking whack it a few times real quick? No? Okay. He goggled at her. It was Rose, and yet he felt as if he had never seen this woman before in his life. The warmth, the gentle smile. What's that supposed to mean? He stammered, feeling as though he had seen something he should not have. Alphonse turned around again, flustered. Elroy was now back in his direct view. The vampire was still in the same spot, watching, motionless. Alphonse had almost forgotten about him. Now was hardly the time to be talking with Rose. He needed to finish off the vampire, Elroy, for good. He looked back at Rose and they nodded to one another. Rose began to walk towards Elroy, leaving the exhausted Alphonse behind. Elroy remained still, his head bowed, mumbling something absent-mindedly to himself. Rose pointed her remaining pistol at his head. All she needed to do was pull the trigger and it would all be over. But she didn't. She stopped, confused. Something wasn't right. The scent is gone. Suddenly, Elroy looked up and faced Rose. His eyes were wild and unfocused. Wait, I haven't lost. Of course I haven't. I could never lose the like of him. I just need to drink more blood. The likes of Alphonse will never... So maybe he's not the real vampire? His eyes suddenly darted to Rose's face with terrible intensity. The monstrous grin stretched wide. The next moment, the wound that had been left by Alphonse's slash began to erupt red mist with incredible force. The mist filled the surrounding area at an alarming rate, and their field of vision was completely obscured by the crimson haze. All that could be heard was Alphonse's voice crying out, "Rose, what's happening?" "Stay calm," she ordered. "It isn't harmful." The red mist was yet another special ability of vampires, employed only in moments of desperation. The creature would use its own wounds as a kind of smokescreen, knowing full well from experience. Rose tried to track Elroy by his scent. Oh, okay. I was like, the scent disappeared. I thought maybe, because, we still got several chapters left, so I'm assuming they don't kill the vampire here, that maybe, he was a vampire, but he wasn't, like, the big bad vampire. It should have been easy. She didn't need to see the vampire to find it, and yet there was nothing. Despite having every reason to believe that he was right in front of her, not a trace of the vampire's trail was to be found. Why, she wondered, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. Slowly but surely, the red mist began to dispel. When it cleared, only two figures remained, Rose and Alphonse. The vampire was nowhere to be seen. "Damn it!" she cried. Elroy had managed to escape from them, but where? With a wince, Alphonse rose to his feet. "Rose, we can't lose him!" All things considered, it seemed safe to assume that Elroy was searching for more victims to drain in order to replenish his own power. Meaning that if they didn't catch him before then, there would be more fatalities. Not to mention the possibility that he might grow too strong for them to handle. Rose waved Alphonse to silence. "Hold on, I'm trying to follow his scent." Though she meant to reassure Alphonse in her own way, Rose felt deeply uneasy. How could the trail just disappear like that all of a sudden? She'd never known anything like it. Is my power growing weaker, she wondered to herself? Just as she was pondering potential causes, though, the scent suddenly returned. The fact that fact did nothing to allay her confusion. But as long as there was a trail to follow, pursuing it needed to be their top priority. She focused her mind on the odor, trying to ascertain its location. Eventually, she was able to find the answer she thought. The source was startling. It's coming from the direction of that tavern. Luca is evil! The Allegria was only one street away from where they stood. I guess maybe he's just going to eat Luca, actually, but Alphonse didn't even spare Rose a glance. He just dashed off towards the restaurant, his face a mask of fear. Probably because, he's got a personal grudge against Alphonse, I guess. Or Luca is evil, which, possible. And let's water up. 30 pages. Is that allowed? Chapter 10. Into the Darkness. Ordinarily, the late hour is the peak of business hours for the Allegria Tavern. On any other day, the chairs would be filled with familiar faces, chattering away, enjoying food and drink, but tonight, not a single seat was taken, for so great was the terror of the vampire murders that none dared to leave their homes. Left with nothing else to do, Luca had set about cleaning the tavern, but the task was quickly finished. She slouched at the spotless counter, thoroughly bored. There hadn't been any sign of our friend Alphonse that day, still considering the rumors that she had heard that the Grand Team's night patrols, it wasn't all that surprising. He must be really busy, she thought to herself. Still, she couldn't pretend that she wasn't disappointed by that fact. Thoughts of Alphonse weighing on her mind, she let out a gloomy sigh. The tavern owner stopped washing cutlery on the other side of the counter and gave her a warm smile. "Go along home for today. It's dangerous around these parts lately, so you're best getting back," he called. Just as when she went to do so, however, the bell over the door chimed. The customer entered the tavern. Luca jumped out of her chair in a panic. What she saw made her gasp. Standing in the doorway of the tavern was a young man in a bloodstone soldier's uniform. Letting out a short shriek of horror, she rushed over to the man. The uniform he had on was the same as the one worn by Alphonse, leading her to immediately think it might be him. As she drew closer, though, she realized it wasn't. Relief watched over her. Thankfully, just some random stranger who's gonna die. Having a closer look at his face, Luca was startled to find that she actually recognized him. A long time ago when Alphonse had first joined the army, he had brought the man before her with two to visit the tavern. You remember hearing the two of them weren't on very good terms anymore, however. His name was Elroy. The tavern owner hurried over with a first aid kit, clearly concerned, but Elroy showed no interest in him. His eyes were focused unwaveringly on Luca. Hello, friend of Alphonse. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me, he muttered. The following smile was anything but inviting. By the time Alphonse and Rose arrived, the tavern was in a terrible state. Chairs were strewn everywhere, tables lay in pieces all over the space, and the floor was covered in smashed glass and broken crockery. On the other side of the counter, they found the owner, blood trickling from his temple. Calmly, Rose used the church's thaumaturgy to heal him. Its mysterious power closed his wound, and soon after he regained consciousness. The second he did, Alphonse began to bombard him with questions. What happened here? Where's Luca? He couldn't see any sign of her, and that worried him intensely. A boy in a military uniform came. No, that was no human, it was a monster. I tried to fight him off, but he took Luca. The moment he uttered Luca's name, he fell unconscious once again. Not long after, the soldiers who had been patrolling the surrounding area heard what had happened and hurried to the scene. The area soon filled with the sounds of people's voices and soldiers running up and down the streets. Even a number of the local residents had woken up and began to gather to see what was going on. Eventually, Garan himself arrived and set about questioning the tavern's owner and investigating the scene with a number of his subordinates. Alphonse and Rose, meanwhile, stood in the shadow of a building not far away. Damn you, Elroy! Alphonse cried as he punched one of the brick walls with all his might. Nearby, Rose stood with her arms folded, deep in thought. Stay calm, we have every reason to believe that Luca is still alive. Elroy had fled to search for new blood to heal his injuries and increase his power. If he was intending to use Luca for that purpose, there was no reason to take her away. It would have been far quicker and easier to drink her blood in the tavern, thus, it was safe to assume that he had a different purpose in mind for her, and the most likely reason seemed to be to use her to lure them somewhere. I suspect I know where he is headed, said Rose. She pointed down at the ground below her feet. During the previous day's encounter with Elroy, he had summoned a large number of ghouls out of seemingly nowhere, each of them victims without families or friends to notice their absence. Elroy had been inducting them in secret and storing them somewhere for when he wanted them, and there was every reason to believe there were more. To stash them, he would need quite a sizable area, but it was also had to be one where the chance of them being found would be quite low. In other words, a place that no one really went. A perfect match for both these conditions was the network of underground passages beneath the city. Bro, I ain't going to the sewers, man. Fuck all y'all. The tunnels had been built during the Dark Ages several hundred years prior, and they were not normally used by people. Somewhere in there, Rose theorized, Elroy was probably waiting for them. Alphonse proposed that they depart immediately. After all, every second they waited increased the danger that Luca was in. Rose, however, stood silently, her eyes cast downwards. Is something bothering you? Alphonse asked. Her mouth tightened. Two things, in fact. First, I suspect that Elroy isn't what is known as an elder vampire. There were, Rose explained, several kinds of vampires. Those who were legitimate descendants of the race were known as true ancestors. The true ancestors were said to have all perished, but those who were closely related to them were known as elder vampires. And unlike true ancestors, some elder vampires still remained. Elder vampires were filled with the lust of blood every 10 or so years, and in surrendering themselves to that lust, they have been responsible for countless deaths throughout history. As a vampire hunter, but therefore they were Rose's most important targets. I did think it was kind of weird that he's eating people frequently. You know, usually in fiction, vampires don't have to eat that often, or feed, because you'd give yourself away for people are dying every single day. But I guess it's a special feeding frenzy he's in. Furthermore, they are apparently among the most powerful of all vampires with exceptional growth potential. As an example of this, Rose explained that when Luca was first attacked, she had been guided to a deserted area by a high-level ability called Charm, which allowed the user to control the thoughts of their victim to a certain degree. It was finding out that Luca had lost her memories of what had happened when she first attacked that night, had first alerted Rose to the possibility that Elroy might be an elder vampire, and that was what had first led her to try and distance Alphonse from the investigation. The fact that they were dealing with an elder vampire was only one of her concerns, however, though. The other was closely related to it. The astonishing power elder vampires possess is amplified even further at night. Because of that, it should be impossible for them to be able to completely disguise their presence. And yet, in the battle against Elroy earlier, he had been able to do just that, allowing him to make his escape. And it so surprised Rose that she had missed her chance to finish him off. It's possible that he's no ordinary elder vampire. Or perhaps he is something even more terrifying, she mused aloud. They had no way of telling what Elroy was truly capable of, or even what he truly was. As such, it was impossible to gauge how much danger they would be putting themselves in by following him, especially knowing that they would be walking right into a trap. While she had no choice but to follow, she found herself questioning whether bringing Alphonse along would really be a good idea. The reservation must have been playing on her face because Alphonse cut off her thoughts with a determined shake of the head. Rose, I've already told you that I'm not going to die. I won't let you be alone ever again. I don't care how strong our opponent is, I'm not going to go back on my word. The resolve was clear and unwavering in his eyes. With or without her blessing, he would see it through to the end. He could not, would not, abandon someone living a life of solitude like he once did. The pure innocence of that emotion and empathy was enough to recall her own bleak loneliness. Dark feelings passed over her features like a cloud obscuring the stars. There was, after all, one other secret she had yet to part with. But that, more than anything, was the cause of her solitude. The warmth of his words almost coaxed her from her lips. So moved was she, but now wasn't the time. For the moment, his heartfelt declaration was enough for her. Their priority needed to be saving his friend. Everything else could wait. I'm sorry, she said. I thought I had overcome my hesitations, but it seems that wasn't the case. With a mental shake of her head, she pushed her doubts deep within her, slowly moved her hand downwards towards her waist. Her fingers sought out her spare blade, the elegant longsword. Unclipping it from her belt, she handed it to Alphonse. This should serve as a replacement for that broken saber. I imagine you'll be able to fight more comfortably with this. Alphonse hefted it in his hand, admiring the balance. He slipped it into a hand's width out of the scabbard for a closer look. Like Rose's other purified weapons, it had a silvery glow that seemed to suck in the light of the red moon. A blow from a blade like this would surely stop a vampire in its tracks. Rose had always known the short sword she had given Alphonse was hardly the ideal weapon for him. She had done this deliberately, hoping that having an unsuitable weapon would dissuade him from trying to get actively involved in battle. And yet not once had he balked at entering the fray. With whatever resources he had at his disposal, Alphonse was always ready to jump right in. Giving him the longsword, therefore, was a sign that she now regarded him as someone worthy of trust, and an apology for underestimating him previously. Alphonse acknowledged the gift and perhaps apology with a nod of the head and attached the blade to a sturdy leather baldric. They regarded one another for a moment, and swore to do what needed to be done. Their mutual resolve reaffirmed, they took off into the deep darkness where Luca and the vampire waited. Next to Heimdall there flowed a great river known as the Honor. Facing out onto it was the Heimdall port, and in one corner of that port was a door that led down into an underground passage. Yo, it's where we fought the crocodile. The entrance was usually locked for safety reasons, where they forced it open without so much trouble and headed inside. The air within was a mixture of mold, rusting metal, and a pervasive smell of damp. Cautiously they moved along the slick stone path, ears and eyes strained for any movement. The tunnel was connected to the river itself, and the torpid water flowed all the way into the deep darkness furthered along the passage. It had been constructed during the Dark Ages, and the network of passages under the city was so vast that no one knew just how far it stretched, or exactly what lay within it. The entire area had long been abandoned. No maintenance or modernization had ever been done. To Alphonse's eye, it looked as though they were setting foot in some ancient labyrinth untouched by time or man for hundreds of years. They proceeded deeper inside, following Elroy's trail along the waterway with only the faintest of light from the red moon trickling through the periodic grates to illuminate their path. The scent coming from him had returned in full force, filling the air with tension as they drew closer and closer to their quarry. They proceeded cautiously and more slowly now as even the light from the moon eventually abandoned them during their descent. The pitch-black darkness did not last for long, however. As they advanced, they soon started to come across torches here and there, attached at intervals along the wall. The glow from the flickering light was both inviting and sinister. It looks like he's been using this place as a hideout for quite a while, Alphonse commented. He and others, Rose thought with distaste. It seemed very likely the people Elroy had abducted were somewhere around here too. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind than she sensed movement. She sighed. It looks as though we're too late. The meaning of Rose's words soon became clear. Slowly but surely, a number of figures drew closer to them from ahead. They shuffled and jerked with unnatural cadence. Ghouls. While Elroy had abducted Luca without drinking her blood, it seems as though he had used the other people he'd been keeping here in her place. Alphonse couldn't help but feel a slight sense of relief when he realized that Luca wasn't among them, but that didn't prove for certain that she was still unharmed. After all Elroy needed to do to get them to chase him was have him believe that there was a chance that she was still alive. As the creatures approached, it was clear that they had no time to waste. Alphonse quickly drew the longsword, while Rose already had her Templar sword and pistol in hand, ready for battle. We need to deal with these first. Right. Their course of action decided, they both charged into the horde of advancing ghouls. It was the first time that Alphonse had been forced to engage with actual combat with ghouls, and he found it emotionally draining. After all, the ghouls weren't nothing more than victims of the vampire. They hadn't chosen to have their lives taken or be compelled to seek to devour their fellows. It had all been forced upon them. As such, he was not fighting to kill them, but to free them. Thinking of it logically didn't do much to reduce the pain of taking out arms against another human being, though. His heart ached every time he cut one down. Rose, meanwhile, was mowing down ghouls like a scythe through the summer harvest. There was nothing more than obstacles in her way, and their shambling attacks were no match for her peerless work with the blade. No matter the speed and skill with which she dispatched them, though, more ghouls emerged from the darkness to block her path. Watching her, Alphonse couldn't help but wonder how long she had been enduring the same pain that he was feeling now. It didn't show on her face, but he remembered the tenderness with which she had handled the ghoul after defeating it on the first meeting. He was disgusted as he with her plight. He wanted to know what had driven her to continue subjecting herself to that pain over and over again. What had driven her to the depths of solitude. But most of all, he wanted to find some way that he could be of help to her. Right now, however, all he could do for her was continue to fight. Shoving down the sorrow he felt with every swing of the sword that met flesh, he kept advancing forward through the masses of bodies before him. Using the torches on the wall as their beacons, Alphonse and Rose hurried as best they could through the maze of passages. Dozens upon dozens of ghouls obstructed their path, but they continued to carve their way forward. They advanced, but slowly, each battle taking a toll on their stamina and energy. Eventually the path ahead of them opened, and they found themselves in a wide, spacious area. The ground around here was gray and soft beneath their feet. It was earth, not stone. A number of crosses were lined up in tidy rows in the sweeping space, probably erected during the Dark Ages. Their bindings looked so weathered that they could have crumbled to the ground at any moment. The area was lit only by a few sputtering torches, but it was enough to see that they must be in the catacomb of some sort. The atmosphere in the subterranean tomb was even gloomier than it had been in the passages they had passed through to reach it. At its center stood a single, silent man wearing a black coat over his tattered army uniform. Alphonse had been leaning exhaustedly against Rose. After their seemingly endless battles with the ghouls, when he spied the familiar figure, he let out a mighty yell. "Elroy!" His voice boomed throughout the chamber, but the other man didn't flinch in the slightest. Instead, he calmly turned to face them. The air grew heavy with malevolence. "I've been expecting you," he said. Smiling, he regarded them with amusement. As his lips crept further and further up, his needle-sharp fangs were slowly revealed, and they were stained a deep, wet red. Oh boy, last four. I will have to pause for a second, because it's been like, 40 minutes. Guys, it's so long. I don't know if I'm going to split this into 2 videos or not. Because it's like going to be like 2.5 hours, not 2, to finish all this. I don't know. We'll see. Alright. Let's, for the final stretch. I think I'll be able to finish all this today. We'll see, though. Chapter 11. Battle in the Catacomb. Watching Elroy turn, Rose knew with a sinking feeling that he had fully recovered from the previous battle. Come on, man. It was also obvious that he was much, much stronger. Come on, man. Considering how much blood he must have drunk to spawn all the ghouls they had fought on their way to reach him, it was hardly surprising, though. Nonetheless, neither Alphonse nor Rose had any way of telling exactly how powerful the monster before them had become. "Where's Luca?" Alphonse shouted. The vampire shrugged as if bored. "Who knows? Maybe I'll tell you if you beat me, big anime energy." He slowly raised his arms and stretched them towards the heavens. An incredible wave of power erupted from his palms, reverberating throughout the catacomb. Alphonse and Rose tensed, but then the rush of energy suddenly stopped. "What was that?" Alphonse cried cautiously. "No!" cried Rose. Though the discharge of power had no immediate visible effect, she knew what was coming. Her grip on her sword tightened. A strange, crumping sound filled the air, like vast, unseen movement. Alphonse's eyes darted over to the area, trying to find the source of the noise. Near one of the crosses he had noticed earlier, something white caught his eye. It was My man's a lich! It was a skeletal human hand. At the start, he realized that similar grasping fingers and limbs were emerging from the other graves surrounding them. The twitching bones were pushing and clawing at the dirt. And not long after, the bodies they had belonged to began to heave their way out of the ground as well. The air was full of cracking and clicking of bones and musty soil. These were the cadaverous remains of those who had been buried long ago. It seems the skill to wake and manipulate the corpses of the dead was yet another ability in the elder vampire's repertoire. Their new undead foes presented another problem. Unlike the ghouls, the skeletons were equipped with varying weapons and equipment. Come on, man! Some had axes and others swords, while many wore helmets and several had shields. Judging from all the armament on display, it seems safe to assume that those who had been buried in this particular catacomb had all been warriors of those who had fallen in battle. Alphonse drew his sword, his back against Rose's. They were completely surrounded. Hey Rose, you want to use any special church powers? Now's a good time for that. What incredible power! Elroy's shriek of laughter cut like a knife through the stifling of withered feet and creaking of rotten leather. His expression was fussed with ecstasy as he surveyed his handiwork. Once free of their earthen graves, the skeletons stood completely still. Unlike the ghouls who had operated entirely on the instinctive desire planted within them, the skeletons were soldiers in the truest sense of the word. They awaited the command of the vampire who had woken them from their eternal slumber. With a sweeping cut of his hand, Elroy gave the signal to attack. The skeletons surged forward en masse towards Alphonse and Rose like a wave cresting the shoreline. Like, Rose, please be a Grail Knight and do the magic glowy thing. Each of them held their weapons out at the ready, but there were simply too many of them to block them all. Just before the undead army reached them, Alphonse felt Rose tap him on his shoulder from behind. Instantly understanding what she was trying to tell them, he swiftly crouched to the ground. As Alphonse ducked, Rose jumped high into the air. She twisted the upper half of her body, her right arm stretched over the left side of her torso. With a powerful swipe, she swung that arm back to the right, her body making almost a full rotation. The motion lent even greater power to her swing as she whipped her Templar sword around at a scything arc. The heads of the closest skeletons exploded in a fine white powder as the segmented blades made contact. The sheer force behind the blow also blasted back the second row of skeletons, giving the pair precious breathing space. Not letting the opening go to waste, Alphonse leaped from the ground and charged forward the sea of bones towards the vampire. Some skeletons tried to oppose his advance, but he simply bashed them aside, slashing, kicking, punching, or otherwise doing whatever he had to in order to remove them from his path. It was ugly, but effective. Elroy was nearly in his reach. Rose, meanwhile, was doing all she could to draw the skeleton's attention. Switching rapidly between her sword and pistol, she did her best to cover Alphonse from afar, attacking enemies bearing down on him from behind him. "Why, Elroy, what happened to you?" Alphonse cried over the clamor of battle. As he smashed his way through the legion of skeletons, he couldn't help but wonder how the two of them had come to this point to begin with. They had first met several years before when Alphonse joined the Imperial Army. Elroy had been an orphan who had lived in poverty before being scouted out of the military by Garand for his exceptional skill with a sword. As such, the two of them shared a lot in common. While Elroy didn't know who his parents were, they were both orphans, and they were both saved from solitude by Garand. They soon felt an affinity towards one another, becoming good rivals and aiding each other in improving their skills. Yet at some point after that, their relationship took a turn for the worse. Even so, Alphonse still saw Elroy as a comrade and respected his strength and skill. No matter how many times Elroy acted unpleasantly or coldly to him, that feeling never changed for him. And that was why even now, after having all he had seen and done, he still couldn't bring himself to believe that Elroy was a vampire. That Elroy, someone who had practically grown up with him, was someone who could heartlessly take the lives of innocent people or toy with them as food. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally dispatched the last skeleton standing between him and Elroy. His path was clear. He raced towards the vampire, silver sword held high and a war cry erupting from his lips. Watching him with undisguised amusement, Elroy smoothly drew his own blade. Once again, their swords locked together in opposition. "I won't let you harm anyone else. As a friend, I can't allow you to do that. Don't you give me that!" Elroy blocked Alphonse's attack with a contemptuous swipe of his own sword, held effortlessly in one hand. He then repelled Alphonse's blade with incredible force. Alphonse's arm was knocked back, and he turned it to his advantage and used the momentum from Elroy's attack to spin around and attack him with a sweeping horizontal slash. Yo, it's badass. Again, Elroy rebuffed him, this time employing but a single finger. The digit was burned by the blade, but though it smoked, Elroy didn't show the faintest sign of concern. Instead, he began to focus his strength into it, causing the sword to begin to crack. Alphonse looked up with gritted teeth, expecting to see the familiar superior sneer on Elroy's face. But instead of a glimpse of a man assured of his own victory, he only saw pure hatred. The look was so intense that he almost faltered. "Friend? How dare you call yourself my friend after you tried to steal what matters most to me?" Was he just that hot for Luca? Elroy's words caught Alphonse so off guard that he wasn't able to react in time to parry the downward strike from Elroy's sword. The blade made contact, slicing through Alphonse's guard and uniform from shoulder to navel. Blood sprayed in the wake of the slash, and he howled in pain. Hearing his cry, Rose called out in concern. The path he had carved to Elroy, however, was long since filled with skeletons that she was diverting, and Alphonse knew he could expect no help from that quarter. Fortunately, the wound was fairly shallow, and as if to demonstrate his fitness, he nimbly retrieved retreated backwards and raised his sword again. What are you talking about? I don't remember ever taking anything from you. Silence, your chance to repent has long since passed. Elroy renewed his attack with relentless force. Alphonse tried valiantly to resist, but his injury impaired him from fighting to his full potential. And Elroy managed to land one slash after another. Blood began to soak through his shirt. Though all superficial, the number of wounds on his body began steadily and increased steadily, and he began to feel lightheaded. Nonetheless, he raised his sword yet again, but with only willpower to kept the blade from wavering. Elroy watched the display with glee, his mouth quirked up in a smile of anticipated victory. Don't worry, you won't be alone for long. That vampire hunter and the girl from the tavern will be joining you very soon. Alphonse trembled at the promise in those words, but they also filled him with renewed determination. Elroy, I don't know what you've got against me, but no matter what it is, I'm not going to let you kill me. I'm not going to go back on my promise. What are you talking about? Elroy asked, the smile slipping from his face. You think you can kill me? Go right ahead and try, because I'm not going to die, and I will stop you. Enough! Enraged, Elroy finally clasped his sword in both hands. Fury and monstrous energy radiated from him in waves. Alphonse knew that this would be his strongest attack yet. You're finished, Elroy cried, swinging his sword downwards with all his might. Death approached from above, and Alphonse saw it coming, but he made no move to block it. His silver sword still raised in front of him, he took Elroy's attack head on. Once again, the vampire's blade made contact with Alphonse's left shoulder, cleaving through body, muscle, bone, and all. Or at least, that's what he expected to happen. What happened next defied all logic. As the sword carried downward, it sheared through Alphonse's left collarbone, then stopped. Trembling with effort, Alphonse looked Elroy straight in the eye, and it was not the look of a man who had been bested. Alphonse had decided to not defend himself against Elroy's attack. Instead, he had resolved to receive it, and focus his concentration to its limit. The moment the blade entered his body, he had suddenly stiffened all his muscles, thus allowing him to... Okay, that's bullshit. Like, straight up fucking nonsense. My man's got super strength. Fucking, you're gonna tense your muscles and stop the sword? That's dumb as hell. I've been, like, on board with this book up until now. That's some stupid ass shit. Elroy was stunned by what had just happened. The outcome was just as far removed from the victory he had envisioned, and that he could only gape at the other man. And it was the shock that Alphonse had been courting. It was creating... Let's try that again. Elroy was stunned by what had just happened. The outcome was just so far removed from the victory he had envisioned that he could only gape at the other man. And it was that shock that Alphonse had been courting. It was the opening he had so desperately created. He does an anime scream. Ignoring the pain surging through his body, Alphonse prepared to strike. Elroy released his own sword's hilt, unable to free the blade embedded in Alphonse's shoulder. He took a half step back. Weaponless, defenseless, the tip of Alphonse's silver sword flew forward, piercing the vampire straight through the chest. And as it sank deep and true, the catacomb fell silent. With a dry sound, almost like a sigh, the skeletons Rose had been fighting crumbled to the ground. Finally free from the need to fight against them any longer, she stopped and turned to Alphonse. She watched in mute astonishment as Alphonse withdrew his sword from the vampire's chest. Elroy dropped to his knees and then collapsed. His enemy defeated, Alphonse then turned his attention to himself. With clenched teeth, he pulled out the sword that had been embedded in his left shoulder. Blood spurted in a bright arc as he freed it. He tried to stop the bleeding by holding his hand over it, but the wound was just too deep. Blood continued to flow out beneath his fingers. Maybe I overdid it a little, he said a bit unsteadily. Rose sighed. You truly are unbelievable. She picked her way over to him, carefully sidestepping bones and weapons in her path. Gently she placed a hand over his, and Alphonse felt a warm sensation suffuse his body. She was using her thaumaturgy to heal his injuries. You only have one life, she chided him. You shouldn't treat it so carelessly. I always knew that you were foolish, perhaps foolish, idiotic imbecile is more appropriate, or a foolishly foolish fool. Despite the admonishing tone of her words, Alphonse could tell from her face just how relieved she was that he was alright. Feeling somewhat guilty for worrying her so much, he watched as his wound rapidly began to close. While her thaumaturgy could only heal physical wounds and not restore his lost stamina, it was still more than sufficient as first aid. Suddenly they heard a soft groaning sound coming from nearby. It had come from Elroy, who was looking up at the ceiling with a vacant expression. His skin had begun to crack and slowly crumble away. He seemed to be trying to say something, but his voice was so quiet that it was impossible to make out what. Rose slowly drew one of her silver pistols and pointed it at Elroy's head. Alphonse started. What are you... His fate is sealed regardless, but I can't allow him to pass like this. There wasn't a moment to waste. As a vampire hunter, she had a duty to finish off her targets. Alphonse, her decision seemed heartless, but he also knew that she had no choice. And yet it still frustrated him that it had to end like this. He still had a lot of questions that he wanted to ask Elroy. Had he been a vampire for the whole of the time that they had known each other? What had driven him to start taking the lives of innocents now? And why did he hate him so much? Nonetheless, he knew that vampires were simply too dangerous to be allowed to exist. As such, he stood by silently, allowing her to do what she thought had to be done. But Rose simply stood with her pistol pointed at Elroy's head, never pulling its trigger. This doesn't make any sense, she murmured. Alphonse looked at her. What doesn't? I don't understand. What don't you understand? There was puzzlement, not a bit of wariness in Rose's reply. There's no sense, none at all. Sense of what? The sense of an elder vampire. At that moment, something flew at incredible speed through the darkness. Two long, narrow objects made up of filthy black blood flashed towards them in a blur. Rose, who sensed their approach first, immediately pushed Alphonse out of the way. As he was thrust from the path of the objects, Alphonse watched in horror, as the sharply pointed lances of blood mercilessly pierced Rose's chest. He fell to the ground with a whoomp, and a moment later, Rose thudded down beside him. Blood began to pool around her inert body. Alphonse couldn't process what was happening, nor was he able to rise to his feet. So weak was he from his earlier battle. Well, well, said a voice. I certainly couldn't have seen that coming. I was hoping to finish you both off at the same time. Out of the dark... Oh! I kind of read ahead by accident. I was hoping to finish you off at the same time. Out of the darkness that the lances that emerged from stepped a figure whose outline and gait was achingly familiar. A man in a military uniform who he knew better than anyone else. Looks like he managed to cheat death again, huh, Al? Garand? That's a cool twist. I like that. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing. That doesn't make sense, though, you know. I guess he's the one who made what's-his-name into, like, a vampire, and also the one who would have, got rid of both their parents. Okay. So maybe he, like, adopts orphans as a way to, like, pick a successor or something? Garand was Alphonse's superior and the commanding officer of a unit of the Imperial Army, responsible for maintaining law and order in Heimdall, widely known as the Garand Team. More than that, he was like a father to Alphonse, and he was the man who had taken him in and raised him after Alphonse had lost his parents. Alphonse knew how hard Garand had been working to try and catch the culprit behind the vampire murders, and how much anguish he felt at not being able to find any leads as to who the criminal might be. Even if he tried not to show it to his subordinates, his desire to help ease that burden on his foster parent was part of the reason that Alphonse was so determined to catch the murderer himself. So what was Garand doing here, in the underground with them? He was supposed to be at the tavern that Elroy had attacked, taking command of the operation. What business could he possibly have here? Alphonse didn't understand, or rather, he didn't want to understand. Garand regarded Alphonse with a strange mix of disappointment and affection, like a father looking at his naughty child. Well, I suppose there's a lot for you to take in. He often made the same face, and Alphonse addressed him too familiarly while on duty. Everything about Garand was the same as ever, and he found that fact very deeply disturbing. It was then that he noticed that Luca was standing next to Garand, her eyes vacant. She didn't seem all that bothered by the carnage all around her. In fact, she didn't seem to be aware of it at all. Charm, said a weak voice, so then that must mean you must be... Turning to his senses, Alphonse looked over in the direction of the voice. It was Rose. She was still lying on the ground. Blood bubbled on her lips from the effort of speaking. It was immediately obvious just from looking at her that the damage she had sustained was lethal. Garand, seemingly surprised that she was still alive, responded to her unfinished question. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Vampire Hunter. Name is Garand. I am the elder vampire that you two have been chasing all this time. He seemed to have no interest in hiding the truth anymore. Sir! It was Elroy. Barely clinging to life, he crawled across the ground to Garand's feet. His clawed hand grasped weakly at Garand's pant leg as if trying to cling to him. I'm sorry, sir. Oh, maybe Garand lied to Elroy about something that Alphonse did, which is why he hates him, or something? Garand kneeled down and took Elroy's hand. Bending over, he lifted him up like a parent might take a child. I mean, I'm glad that's not that he just had the hots for Luca or something. That would have been kind of lame. This is more interesting. It's alright, Elroy. You did wonderfully in luring that loathsome vampire hunter to the capital. I was right to believe in you. I couldn't have asked for more. Listening to Garand praise him, Elroy's expression was one of complete peace. And that's why I have no further use of you. Sleep well. The warmth on Garand's words seemed to drain in an instant. The next moment, a twisted grin emerged on his face, revealing beast-like fangs. No sooner had Alphonse noticed them than they sank into Elroy's neck. For the first time, Alphonse was forced to witness a vampire drinking blood. Elroy howled out in agony, his screams so piercing that Alphonse wanted to cover his ears to block them out. With agonizing slowness, Garan drank his blood, and by draining him, also absorbed the life energy of tens upon tens of innocent human beings that Elroy had killed. All of a sudden, Elroy's formerly youthful body began to shrivel up like a desiccated husk of corn. His youth evaporated, Garan's vitality grew exponentially, or as his youth evaporated. Black smoke began to pour from the youth's body, hiding it from sight. Elroy's cries grew hoarse, then stopped entirely. Finally, his body turned to dust, which fell into the damp earth of the catacomb. Smoke having cleared, leaving only Garan, he was now clad in a black coat in place of his army uniform. And instead of the middle-aged man he had been previously, he now appeared to be roughly the same age as Alphonse. A small line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. He lapped it up with his tongue, his expression one of pure bliss. He then started to look himself over, taking everything in as if trying to adjust to his new body. That man before him was no longer the Garan that Alphonse once knew. He was the very image of the vampires that appeared in Erebonian legend. Simply delicious. It's been over a decade since I last had the chance to taste human blood, but it's just as wonderful as I remembered. That was well worth going through all that tedious preparation for. He gave a satisfied sigh. Alphonse could only look at him in horrified disbelief. You were the one who turned Elroy into a vampire? You were the one who made him drink blood just so you could take it all from him? Now, Garan Tisk. That's not quite true. Not if you know that Elroy willingly chose to become one of us. Garan placed his hands on his chest in mock solemnity, and cast his eyes downward in a thoroughly exaggerated fashion. Elroy was an orphan. He had lived a poor, lonely life, more so than anyone else I've ever known. Then I saw that he was capable of the sword, and I invited him into the army. And so he became to be dependent on me, just as I thought he would. Garan wiped an imaginary tear from the corner of his eye. It was as if he saw me as his real father, he added with a laugh. Alphonse shuddered at the sound, chills running through his whole body. Eventually started to resent you for the fact that I always raised you like a real son. Okay. I kind of thought maybe that could be it too. I didn't know if it was just that or if he lied about maybe blaming Alphonse or something. He wanted to receive that treatment himself, so he tried to find a way to steal that position from you. One day I decided to reveal my true identity to him, and invited him to become a vampire as well. He gladly agreed, hoping that by doing so, he would be able to be more useful to me than you, hoping that I would favor him more than I did you. From a short distance away, Rose still lay on the ground, unable to move and frustrated by what she was hearing. In all likelihood, Garan had given a fraction of his power to Elroy when he had turned him into a vampire. Since that was the reason that Rose assumed that he was an elder vampire that they were searching for. She'd been wrong, and if not for her mistake, they wouldn't be in this perilous situation to begin with. For his part, Alphonse was stunned at the revelation that Elroy had held a grudge against him all this time, and as for the reason for it, it wasn't as though Alphonse had done anything wrong himself or ever tried to hurt Elroy, and yet he was filled with a deep sense of regret. Well, on the plus side, this is taking so long that maybe it's almost morning. I think that's the only real way they could potentially beat the guy, right? With how much he's been hyped up as powerful. If only he had realized how Elroy felt earlier, perhaps he could have prevented him from becoming a vampire, and avoided all this from happening. Furthermore, he had no choice but to admit to himself that Garan was the true culprit behind all of this, and the man who had manipulated a lonely boy to kill countless people so that he didn't have to dirty his own hands. All of a sudden, the fact that they've been unable to stop the vampire murders no longer mattered. No matter how much they strengthened their nighttime patrols made perfect sense. After all, what chance did they have when the mastermind himself was in charge of organizing them? As that truth dawned on him, Alphonse felt a dull, terrible ache in his heart. A thoughtful from Garan brought Alphonse back to things at hand. The vampire licked his lips, now that my hunger has finally been sated. I suppose all that remains is dessert, he purred. He glanced sideways towards the vacant-eyed Luca, with undisguised desire, then wrenched his eyes away and focused on the still form of Rose. But before that, he said, suddenly raising his left hand and pointing at her, I think it's about time our dear vampire hunter left the stage for good. Before Alphonse could even react, countless lances of blood, like the two that had struck from before, formed and flew from his palm towards the fallen woman. Alphonse cried out, but he could do nothing to stop their flight. Rose saw the danger and reacted. Still lying on the ground, she dropped the pistol that she had been secretly aiming at Garan, and at the last second used every bit of strength that remained to her to roll out of the way. He avoided instant death, but it would have only be a momentary reprieve if the vampire decided to strike again. Garan shook his head in amazement. You really are a tenacious one, aren't you? Then how about you just... Stop! Just as Garan was about to launch his next attack, Alphonse jumped at him, sword raised. He slashed with everything he could muster. The sword made contact, but aside from a dull ringing sound, it didn't seem to do any actual damage. Oh my, that's no way to show your appreciation of the man who raised you all these years, Garan said, laughing. He flicked his index finger at Alphonse's forehead, causing an unimaginably powerful shockwave which sent him flying backwards through the air. The silver sword Rose had given him was supposed to be able to kill vampires, and yet it wasn't able to so much as scratch Garan. It was then that Alphonse realized what he was up against, a true elder vampire. Filled with the life energy of countless humans that Elroy had collected, that he stood no chance against whatsoever. The weight of that understudy filled him with despair. The vampire, meanwhile, seemed to think of something. Oh, no. Well, I'm telling you all this, there is one little thing that you might be interested in knowing. Think of this as a reward for surviving for so long. I mean, it's going to be that he killed his parents. Winded from the blow, Alphonse could only gasp. What? He struggled to rise, but he only got as far as kneeling. Garan looked down at him, a vulgar smile playing at his lips. The one who killed your parents was me. Just as Alphonse had thought that nothing else could surprise him, he was proven wrong. Garan's words dragged the sight of his mother and father. All the blood drained from their bodies, lying dead in their home over 10 years ago from his memories. Garan continued, seeming to enjoy Alphonse's reaction. There really was a vampire in that village back then. Naturally, I'm referring to me. Your father seemed to realize the first part and set about trying to find out the vampire's identity in secret. This was the first that Alphonse had heard about this. He had no idea that his father had once tried to do exactly what he and Rose had. He was an exceptionally capable soldier, you know, Garan continued. Far as capable to be stuck in a backwater village like that, but that ended up being his undoing. He very nearly succeeded in discovering that it was I whom he was seeking, and that's why I killed him with my own hands. Him and his wife who was helping him. Alphonse stumbled to his feet and broke into a lurching charge at Garan. With frenzied slashes and thrusts, he attacked the vampire, almost as if to avoid having to listen to what it was saying. Garan laughed as he batted away the weak blows. The only problem with my plan was you, Al. I intended to kill you at the same time. You were still a child at the time, and I couldn't allow anyone who might know my true identity to live. And yet when I came to take care of you, you were away from the house. No matter how many times Alphonse hacked at Garan, he could not connect. His silver sword, his fury, his grief, it all seemed meaningless against his foe. Nothing he did could hurt the creature who had taken everything from him. Completely ignoring Alphonse, Garan continued talking. Couldn't very well kill you on a separate occasion either, not with the chance that the vampire hunter I'd heard was skulking about might catch wind of it and come after me. Many strange murders in such a small town like that would be quite suspicious after all. And that's why I decided to keep you close to me instead, so that I could keep an eye on you myself. Effectively, it seemed Garan's plan was to make sure that Alphonse never remembered anything that might help him realize the vampire's true identity. If he had, he would have been killed. The man he thought he knew, the man who had cared for him like a father, was a lie. Slowly, as the full bitter truth began to sink in, he could feel the hot prickle of tears stinging his eyes. But that won't be necessary anymore. I no longer have any reason to allow you to live any longer. Garan had previously been disregarding all of Alphonse's futile attempts to hurt him, but suddenly he went on the offensive. Lightning quick, he bypassed Alphonse's guard, and his fist made contact with the young man's right side. Bones crumpled under the sharp blow, and once again, Alphonse was sent flying. He landed hard, but was almost immediately up once again through sheer force of will. Pain was incredible, and something was broken inside him, but it didn't matter. He simply couldn't forgive the man, the creature in front of him, for what he had done. You can't win, Al. You must know that. Just give up and die. This time Garan came to him. His attacks were relentless, like water gushing from a broken dam. Again and again, his tightly clenched fist pounded Alphonse with the force of a wrecking ball. Unable to defend himself from the onslaught, Alphonse was showered with punches, blood spraying through the air with every strike. Ow. Faintly, he heard Rose call his name. She barely seemed to maintain consciousness. If he lost here, Rose would be killed for sure. As with Luca. Losing wasn't an option. Being killed wasn't an option. Defeat of any kind wasn't an option, considering what was at stake. Sharp pain in his side signaled another bone breaking. Blood trickled down his lips as he bit back a groan. The more time passed, the closer he was to drawing to death's door. Nonetheless, he slowly raised his sword again, swinging it downward with the last of his strength. As he did, Garan aimed another punch at him from directly in front. With a dull metallic sound, the blade snapped in two. The power of the blow sent the top half flying. It flipped end over end and back, clear through Alphonse's right shoulder. It ended impaled into the ground next to where Rose lay. The moment it sliced through him, it felt as though his strings had been cut as well. He had no more energy left to fight. He couldn't even maintain his grip on the broken sword in his hand. He crumpled to the ground, too exhausted to go on. As he did, another faint memory of the past resurfaced in his mind. During the short period before his parents' murders, there had been a girl who often came to their home who had introduced herself as an acquaintance of his father's. She used to take him out to play practically every day so that he wouldn't disturb his father while he was working. Thinking back, the work he had been doing must have been investigating the vampire. It was one of those days that the murders took place. If he had been home with his parents at the time, he would no doubt have been killed alongside them. It's thanks to her taking him out that day that he had been able to live in ignorance for so long and avoid being killed by Garand. He had long forgotten, or perhaps his parents' murders had left such a deep scar inside him that all memories of the period had been pushed into the depths of his subconscious. He found himself wondering how she was doing now, whether she was alright. He hoped she was. These were the idle thoughts that filled him as he lay defeated on the ashen earth, Garand's mocking laughter filling his ears. And now, Al, I think it's time to finish this. My brain is kind of fried at this point. Your mother and father are waiting for you up with the goddess. Vampire held the fingers of his right hand straight and rigid, thumb folded inward as if performing a karate chop, and then swung it downward towards Alphonse like the blade of a guillotine, aiming directly for his neck. White light suddenly filled the area, obscuring all else. At the same time, Alphonse heard the sound of something rending the air. Realizing that he was still alive, he slowly opened his eyes. The hand that had been about to slice through Alphonse's neck had a giant hole at its center. Garand had his left hand wrapped around his right wrist and was staring at the hole in horror. Unable to process what had just happened, the edges of the wound smoked and sizzled. Impossible! Before him stood Rose. Her injuries had been beyond most humans' ability to survive, yet there she stood, unwavering, a smoking silver pistol in her hand. Her lips were still bright with blood, but her voice was steady. I will not allow you to lay another finger on him. So, like, what's the age gap here? Because I know she's older than Alphonse, but would she have been old enough to be the lady that he's thinking? I mean, I guess it has to be her, right? But her eyes blazed with a bright crimson fire. We're getting there. We're getting there. Oh, or is she a vampire? Based on the chapter title? I mean, I guess that would make sense, kind of. She's like a vampire that hunts other vampires. So the age gap wouldn't matter. Or like, you know, she wouldn't have aged really. So she would still seem to be the same approximate age as Alphonse. Chapter 13. True Ancestor. Rose had been prepared to accept her own death. Garand's lances of blood had perforated several of her organs, and she no longer had the strength to use thaumaturgy to heal herself. Considering that her occupation was hunting vampires, she always knew that this might happen. That one day one of the vampires she tried to kill might instead end her own life. Nonetheless, her task was to try and defeat as many of them as she could before that happened. That was her penance, her way that she would try and atone. That time had finally come. She had done all that she could, and yet she had been powerless to defeat Garand. If she just closed her eyes, she would never wake up again. Perhaps that would be the easiest and least painful option. Consciousness fading, her lips began to droop. Then she saw something in the corner of her field vision. It was Alphonse, desperately struggling against something he could not hope to beat. To see him fighting on, he who had battled beside her every step of the way, made her heart ache. She watched his final last-ditch attack fail and the silver sword she had given him shatter. The upper half of its broken blade flew towards her, pierced the damp earth by her head. The silvery sheen of the sword fragment blurred in her vision and came back into focus. It was wet with Alphonse's blood. Okay, so she's a vampire that probably doesn't feed, but when she feeds, she becomes the most powerful being in existence. Okay, I mean, that's kind of cool. I vaguely thought something about that early on, but I kind of forgotten about it, but... The sound of her heart pounding drowned out all of the noises. It was a sensation that she was determined to never feel again, or rather, one that she felt but desperately tried to ignore. But she couldn't surrender herself to death just yet. Alphonse swore to her that he wouldn't allow himself to die. He was doing everything possible to keep that promise. It was her turn to show the same kind of courage that he was. She reached out a hand, ignoring the pain running through it, and grasped the broken blade. He bent it close to her upturned face and stretched out her tongue towards the blood dripping down its surface. And then she licked it. The instant blood touched her lips, her vision became awash in a scarlet haze. She knew that she was taking a huge risk, and her heart was filled with a new, different resolve. It was a risk worth taking. You can't be! You can't be! Garand glanced at her, still clutching at his wound with his left hand. She opened her mouth again to speak, her whole body shrouded in a faint, crimson radiance. My name is Roselia, she said. I am a descendant of the loathsome race of vampires and a true ancestor. As she introduced herself anew, she gave herself a polite curtsy. Alphonse watched the exchange from his low vantage point of the ground. It was not the first time he had heard the term true ancestor. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, they wouldn't have mentioned that term if it wasn't important, so, I kind of was thinking about that in the back of my head, too. He recalled Rose mentioned it once before. She had said that they were the legitimate descendants of the vampire race. In one hand Rose held one of her pistols, and the other the fractured end of the silver longsword she had given Alphonse. Looking at the blood that had been coated in, she had been able to return from the brink of death, just like Garan had been able to revitalize himself by drinking Elroy's blood before. The connection was clear, and yet unlike Garan's gruesome action, Rose's blood drinking seemed more like a kind of holy ritual. Perhaps due to his inability to move or do anything other than lie and watch, Alphonse was able to process the situation quite sedately. Rose had been a vampire all along. He found himself somehow unalarmed by that bit of information and didn't question it. Garan was not so calm. A true ancestor? Impossible. The true ancestors are all... Rose spread her hands in acknowledgement. Indeed, the true ancestors are no more. They chose to allow themselves to perish. Then they realized the truth, that if human blood was required for the race to continue to exist, then the right thing to do was to allow it to die. That a life such as this has no meaning, I am the very last true ancestor in existence. She spoke solemnly, her expression dignified. I cannot forgive your kind. You elder vampires fled because you were unable to suppress your lust for blood. And then you brought shame on the name vampire by attacking innocent humans, all because of your own inability to resist your obscene desires. Spare me your lecturing, Garan yelled, and then quickly thrust out the right hand which Rose had damaged. From it emerged another barrage of blood lances, which shot towards Rose at great speed. But the moment they were about to impale her body, she turned into red mist, generating a blast wave in the air. Instantly she appeared behind Garan, both pistols in hand, and fired bullet after bullet into his body. Bullets emitting the same effulgent red aura as Rose struck him all over. Garan was thrown forward by the impacts, which hit him with the force of a shotgun shells. He twitched and groaned on the ground in agony. Satisfied the vampire would be immobile for a time, Rose crouched down beside Alphonse. His eyes were open, watching, but he was unable to move. Rose gently caressed his cheek with her hand. Thank you, Al. Thanks to you, I know now what I must do. I have a lot that I want to say to you, but for now we'll have to wait. Alphonse turned his head towards her, and for a brief moment he saw the figure of the girl he played with when he was a child. He finally realized the truth. Too exhausted to even open his mouth, he had to content himself with silently encouraging her in his own mind. Almost as if she could sense him doing so, Rose nodded, then stood up again. She looked over at Garan with the same solemn expression as before. His wounds had begun to close, but by the time that it took for them to do so, it said everything. The power of a true ancestor was enough to be able to contend with him. Foolish girl, what's wrong with drinking the blood to survive? Humans take the lives of others so they can continue to exist too. How's the weak do any different? Rose shook her head. It's completely different. Vampires have inhuman strength and can manipulate others to do whatever they desire. Spawn ghouls is a byproduct of what they do. Everything about our existence goes against the natural laws of the world. We are a violation of the will of the goddess, and that is why we should be confined to the realm of fairy tales. Rose was a vampire who hunted other vampires because of her own strong belief and ideals. A vampire who had resolved to deny her own race, to wipe them out, hoping that they would all be forgotten forever. Alphonse desperately tried to stay conscious, his eyes fixed on her. He finally understood the ideal that she had strived for and the true nature of the solitude she carried, a solitude that not even those of her own race could have possibly understood. You little... Have it your way then! Grinding his teeth in anger, Garan held out a hand before him, and the palm formed a monstrous sword made up of jet black blood. The black coat that he wore also began to squirm and transform. Giant wings like those of a bat emerged from his quivering mass. With a toss of his head, they unfurled, extending to either side of him. They flapped once, twice, and Garan rose into the air. Suddenly Luca fell to the ground, unconscious. Garan had released the charm he had on her to concentrate all his energy into his next attack. Allow me to bring an end to your bloodline for good and return the name True Ancestors to ancient history where it belongs, he roared. Rose drew her Templar sword, her navy coat still bathed in scarlet light. It became bat-like wings as well. She held his gaze as she ascended to his level. It's time you gave it the name Elder Vampire. You do nothing but soil it. Blades drawn, they confronted one another in midair. Bro, this is so anime. Charged energy cackling through the catacombs. Alphonse lay back, unable to do anything but observe. The next moment, their shadows crossed at lightning speed. At an instant, they exchanged places in the air. Both had swung their swords. The blade of Rose's Templar sword, however, was nowhere to be seen. All that could be glimpsed here and there in the flickering torchlight was the glinting of wires stretched to their limits. Garan was the first to make a sound. Lines ran across his body in a crisscross of faint stripes. As he laughed, the lines spread like cracks, slowly multiplying and widening, almost as if his body hadn't quite realized that it had been cut at all. Countless parts that formed the Templar sword's blade had passed through his body over and over in a single instant. Rose turned and with a snap of the wrist caused the wires connecting the blade's parts to bend. With metallic clicks of interlocking metal, the parts flew through the air and came together. The Templar sword was once again whole. Farewell. I'm sure we'll meet again one day in hell. As the Templar sword returned to its complete form, the body of the Elder Vampire crumpled to the ground, feet first. Bro, it's so anime. I kind of like it. If I'm being honest, if I'm being real honest, it's got like big vampire DBZ energy or something. Chapter 14, A New Dawn. When Alphonse awoke, he found himself in the center of the catacomb. No sound stirred the musty air. The first thing he saw when his eyes opened was the gentle smile of Rose as she looked down at him. He was no longer surrounded by the crimson glow that he had witnessed earlier. She seemed to have healed him as well. He could hardly pretend to be back at full strength, but he was at the very least now capable of moving. Next to him lay Luca, fast asleep. She had no visible wounds, but she was clearly exhausted from all the night's events. She had been through quite an ordeal after all. What happened to Garand? Alphonse had lost consciousness around when he and Rose had clashed in the air, so he hadn't witnessed any of the aftermath. Rising shakily to his feet, he saw Rose indicate a point a short distance away by turning her head in that direction. There he saw the body of Garand, or at least part of it. Everything below his chest had vanished. Ow. His voice was weak, but somehow he was still alive. Looking at him, Alphonse couldn't help but feel pity. How anything could survive in such a state he didn't know? But it was a testament to the incredible powers of the vampire race that he still drew breath. However, it was not a state that would last forever. He is beyond saving, Rose said with certainty. She loaded a bullet into her pistol and pointed it at Garand's temple. It seemed as though she had deliberately waited until Alphonse awoke before finishing him off. But I thought it best to wait so that you could witness it yourself. Alphonse looked from the gun to Garand. Alright. She began to gently squeeze her finger against the trigger. Garand cast his eyes downward, a look of acceptance on his face. But before she could pull it completely, Alphonse stopped her. Looking at her bewildered expression, he pulled out from his uniform the silver short sword that she had given to him originally. Let me do it. So you want to carry out your revenge yourself, do you? Sneered Garand in response. What a fool you are. You have no reason to dirty your own hands. Why do you humans have to make such a big deal out of trivial things? That's what makes you so easy to manipulate. Silence, Rose said, raising her gun a second time. Alphonse shook his head at her and turned to Garand. I've always thought of you as a father. Maybe it was all a lie. Maybe you had ulterior motives for everything you did. But I still think of you like a parent even now. And I'm grateful for what you did for me. A look of shock flashed across Garand's face. Rose appeared stunned as well. Alphonse continued, so I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this so that I can move on and put all this behind us and start a new life. Alphonse stared down at the man, creature, who had cared for him, raised him, and who he had thought loved him. With an ache in his heart, he swung the sword. Rose watched on in silence. Only the sound that broke the still quiet of the underground was the steady tread of their boots against the slimy cobblestones. Together, Rose and Alphonse trekked back through the gloomy passage towards the surface with Rose leading the way. On Alphonse's back was Luca, still oblivious to the world. Whenever they came across the corpse of one of the innocents who had been turned into a ghoul, he stopped, closed his eyes, and prayed for them. Rose had told him that the church would be sending people to collect their bodies and give them a full burial later. As the existence of vampires and ghouls was not to be made public, all of what happened there would be buried. The world would never know the truth behind the vampire murders. They made their way through the torchlit channel and eventually reached the area near the entrance where the natural light now shone through. Rose stopped so suddenly that Alphonse almost walked into her. Whoa, what's wrong? He asked, readjusting Luca's position on his back. Rose hesitated. There's actually one more thing I think that I ought to tell you. She turned to him, looking heavily apologetic. Her words were followed by another period of silence, as if she was having trouble mustering the courage to tell him the truth. Realizing this, Alphonse decided to say it for her. This is about how the person who died trying to help you was my father? So you realized. Rose herself hadn't made the connection until she discovered Garand's true identity. But the two cases were so closely connected that she had eventually understood. It had been over a decade ago that Alphonse's father had coincidentally come to meet the vampire hunter Rose. He found out that she was pursuing vampires, and they had agreed to work together on the same end. Eventually, he had been but one step away from discovering the identity of the nearby vampire, in other words, his friend, Garand. But that was when Garand had realized that he was in danger of being found out, and killed him before he had the chance to share his findings with her. But how did you know that was me? You have no way of knowing how many other vampire hunters may be out there, after all. Alphonse gave a sheepish smile. During the fight earlier, I finally remembered meeting you back then. Alphonse's father had always been worried about the possibility his family might be harmed because of his research. That was why he had come to ask Rose to watch over his child whenever he was investigating. It had taken him a long time to recall the girl had played with him all those summers ago, but Alphonse had finally placed that familiar gentle smile. She nodded, admitting the truth to him. I was the one responsible for getting your father involved in this to begin with. I should have searched for and fought the vampire by myself, and yet I wasn't able to refuse his offer. And despite that weakness, resulting in the death of him and his wife, I wasn't able to refuse your offer this time either. Rose had been fighting a solitary battle against her own race for decades. It wasn't difficult to imagine her hoping, unconsciously, That someone, anyone who would hold out a hand to and help her. That was why when Alphonse and his father had done so, she couldn't bring herself to turn them down. I never intended to drink blood again either. I just didn't want to admit that I was a monster just like him. And just like the other vampires, I grew weaker by the year as a result, but still, I was determined not to do it. A look of disgust crossed her face, and again I ended up breaking my own vow and drinking it, regardless. Perhaps I'm no different from the rest of them after all. I mean, as long as you're not taking it by force, I guess it's not, like, ethically dubious. As long as, you're not, coercing people, manipulating them, killing them. I mean, I guess it's okay. Alphonse knew the solitude she had endured better than anyone else, so he replied with a smile. Don't worry about it, he said. You did it to save me, didn't you? That alone makes you different from other vampires. I'm sure my parents would be grateful for all that you've done. If not for you, I would have been killed, and if not for you, we wouldn't have been able to solve the murders here either. So, thank you. Unable to reply in the face of his warm words, Rose turned away from him. For the first time, she felt as though she'd accept herself. The thorns which had been constricting her heart receded, as if melting away. Alphonse began walking again, his eyes pointed straight ahead, tactfully avoiding looking at Rose's face while she stood still, her shoulders quivering. After that, neither of them said another word to each other as they made their way to the exit. The natural light peeking into the tunnel here and there gradually grew brighter, and eventually the gate came into view. Emerging entirely from the underground, they could see that the eerie red moon no longer hung in the sky. In its place was the sun, burning the morning haze away and bathing the city in a dazzling bright sunlight. Well, this is where I must take my leave, Rose said, giving Alphonse a slight bow. The vampire's presence is gone from the city. Rose's mission was now over, and she had no reason to remain. Much as Alphonse wished he could stay a little longer, he nodded, responding with a simple, "Alright." "Where will you go next?" he asked. Rose shook her head. "I don't know," she replied. Whenever she went, she would no doubt be pursuing yet another vampire. And there would always be no doubt that she would find herself fighting against it in a battle to the death, too. That was her duty as a vampire hunter, and as a true ancestor. When you've done everything you need to do, come back here. What? Rose had already walked a short distance ahead of him, but she turned around again at those words. "I've been waiting for you here," he said. Alphonse had no idea how long it would take for her to fulfill that duty that she had sworn to see to the end, but it didn't matter. He wanted her to know that there would always be a place for her to return to, and as long as that was the case, she would never be alone again. "Thank you," Rose smiled, unable to conceal the happiness welling up within her. Alphonse returned the smile, and once more she turned, striding away into the brilliant sunlight. She didn't turn around again. On Alphonse's back, Luca had awoken, and had been awake for some time. She couldn't help but feel a little jealous of their exchange, but she had decided to feign being asleep so as not to interrupt their farewells. "Bro, you passed up on having a vampire GF? What's wrong with you, Alphonse?" And thus the vampire murders that had been terrorized the people of Heimdall silently came to an end. No one the wiser as to the culprit or the conclusion of the whole affair. The criminal dead, the murders would be simply stop, and the case itself would be doomed to be left unsolved for all eternity. No doubt the people of the city would one day forget that they had ever happened at all, or they would live on as a kind of an urban legend, no one believing such stories could possibly be true. But Alphonse would always remember what had happened, and he would never forget the case where he had lost several people who were deeply important to him. He would also never forget that he had found someone else important to him during it all, and he prayed that one day in the future she would be able to find peace, freed from the deep solitude and arduous duty that burdened her. "Every dark night is followed by a bright new dawn," he murmured. "So I'm sure that one day a new dawn will come for you too." Alphonse stood still, watching silently as Rose, walking off into the distance, vanished into the morning sun. Bro, my tongue, it's dying. I actually really liked Red Moon Rose. I don't know. I mean, it's big, like, anime energy, which, I mean, I enjoyed. Didn't, like, a kid give us some of these books? Who's letting their kid read this shit? All the talk about people getting torn apart and everything. I mean, granted, I experienced more violent media as a kid, too, but, look how I turned out, man. Yeah, I actually really liked Red Moon Rose. It's my only real complaints, too long. Definitely, it's a little too long. You could have probably cut out, like, at least 2 chapters, just in, like, I mean, yeah, not really, like, cut them out directly, but just, like, the wording of, so much of it's, like, a little too long-winded at times, which kind of made it drag slightly. And then the whole part about Alphonse just, tightening his muscles so the sword didn't go through is dumb as hell. Like, so dumb. Because they've already established that my man had super strength, because, I mean, he was able to shatter a sword with his finger. And you're telling me that Alphonse, a normal-ass dude, is able to tighten his muscles enough that he couldn't tear through it with a full-force swing? nonsense. But other than that, actually quite enjoyable. I think I may even I might actually be the book that I enjoyed the most of all the novels we've read. I guess I just found it the most entertaining. I don't know if it's the best per se, but I definitely enjoyed reading it, even though it was it did take like 2.5 hours. I think we will probably split this into 2 videos. At about like the chapter 7 point, it'll just kind of, well, no, that's Carnelian. Yeah, about the chapter 7 point, we'll probably just kind of have it like abruptly end and then pick back up. Just because, I mean, it's like 2.5 hours, and it'll give an extra Trails video, I guess, for people who are interested in that, to kind of lessen the drought between the start of it and between the end of the main Let's Play and the start of Trails 2. Not Trails 2, Cold Steel 2. Which will definitely happen, you know, probably within like 2 weeks max between the time this video goes up, I would say. I've definitely gotten the itch to play Cold Steel 2 now the finale's going up, which is what I expected to happen. It's the same thing that happened with Azure, where I was like, I'm going to take a break. And then once the finale started going up and I was rewatching the videos, I was like, oh man, this is like friggin' sweet as hell. I need to go ahead and get on that next game. But yeah, I'm actually Cheese 87. Next bonus video will be doing the side story. I think I'm just gonna try and read it, and then maybe talk about it at the end of the video, as opposed to just like watching, or I mean, I guess I don't really. I mean, there is like a, you know, an audio drama CD version of it, but I mean, I'm not really listening to it because I don't understand the language, so I'm still just kind of reading it, I suppose. But I don't know. I think I have more fun reading it aloud myself and being able to occasionally like crack jokes and stuff. It will be probably like very hard to follow with there being about 12 different characters, but because I mean the Road to the Future CD I had a lot of fun reading too, or the transcript, but there were definitely parts where I was like, it was kind of a pain to try and juggle 6 different characters and make it clear that who's talking, since I don't have the ability to give like everyone distinct voices and stuff. But yeah, that'll be the next video, and then after that we'll do a reflection / discussion video sometime in the future before Cold Steel 2. Probably be like a little bit on like a, you know, I would like to keep it like an hour max, just kind of talking about the game and my experiences having done this as a Let's Play, you know, this being the most thorough Trails Let's Play I've done as well, and some other aspects and stuff before we head into the next game. I'm actually